Una vez un futuro, 1.000 millones de vidas. Pero no pude salvar a mi hijo. Una máquina me lo arrebató. Y yo.
¿Qué le pasa a su amiga, joven? No sé, ni la conocemos. Ok.
¿Qué pasó? ¿Qué?
¿Qué le dio?
Nada. Así siempre. ¿Quieres tu sopita de tamal? Ándale, te llevo una vida. Te robo un poquito.
¿Qué pasa, Diego?
¿Dónde está Dani?
Está con el gringo. Me quiere reemplazar por esa maldita máquina.
¿Cuándo va a regresar?
No sé. ¡Vete, Dani!
¿Quién está atrás de mí?
¡Rápido, acelera!
¡Ay, Dios mío!
Some machines arrive from the future, but some stories arrive from the past, carrying all the weight of what we once believed cinema could be. Welcome to the Cineflux. This is a place for films that do not simply pass across the screen and disappear. It is for the stories that stay behind after the sound fades, after the final image goes dark, after the theater becomes quiet again. Here, we do not treat cinema like a checklist of plot points, action scenes, and ratings. We sit with it. We listen to what it is trying to say. We look at the spaces between the spectacle, the moments where the emotion hides, the quiet choices inside loud films, the human pulse beneath the machinery. And today we are stepping into Terminator Dark Fate, a film that carries one of the heaviest burdens any sequel can carry. Because this is not just another action film. It is not just another chapter in a familiar franchise. It is a movie walking into a room full of ghosts. It has the shadow of James Cameron's original vision behind it. It has the towering memory of the Terminator and Terminator 2, Judgment Day standing over every frame. It has decades of expectation, disappointment, loyalty, fatigue, nostalgia, and hope pressed into its metal bones. And maybe that is why this film is so interesting to sit with, not because it is perfect. It is not. Not because it fully escapes the machinery of franchise filmmaking. It does not. But because somewhere inside all that pressure, all that history, all that industrial noise, Terminator, Dark Fate still tries to reach for something human. It tries to ask what survival means after the battle you thought defined your life is already over. It tries to understand what happens when destiny does not arrive like prophecy, but like trauma. It looks at characters who have been shaped by loss, by violence, by time, by impossible responsibility, and it asks whether people can still choose meaning after the future has already taken so much from them. That is the part I keep coming back to. The Terminator franchise has always been about time, but not just in the literal science fiction sense. Time travel is the device. The deeper subject is consequence. What one generation leaves for the next, what violence repeats, what love interrupts, what fear builds, what hope refuses to surrender. And in Dark Fate, that idea returns with a strange sadness. This is a film about futures that keep rewriting themselves, and people who are forced to live inside the revisions. You survive one apocalypse and another one finds a different name. You destroy one machine and history builds another. You save the world and still the world does not become gentle. Think about what that means. It means the fight was weird but it was not final. It means victory can still leave scars. It means the future is not a single door waiting to be opened. It is something human beings keep making, breaking, and remaking with every choice. For a film filled with chases, explosions, enhanced bodies, and impossible machines, there is a quiet ache underneath it, and that ache belongs to Sarah Connor. She is not simply back as an icon. She returns like someone who has outlived the story that once gave her pain a purpose. And that is a rare thing for a blockbuster to even approach. Cinema rarely does this. It often loves heroes at the moment of triumph, but it does not always know what to do with them afterward. What happens to a warrior when the war changes shape? What happens to a mother when the future she fought for still feels haunted? What happens to someone whose entire identity was forged in resistance once resistance becomes the only language they know? Dark Fate is at its strongest when it lets that question breathe. And around Sarah, the film builds a new circle of survival. Dani, who begins not as a symbol but as a person with a life, a family, a routine, a place in the world. Grace, a protector who carries the future inside her body, not like a gift but like a cost. And the machine that wears an old face, carrying the strangest burden of all, the possibility that even a thing built for termination can become altered by time, habit, and proximity to human life. Here is the thing about this film. It is a movie about machines, but it is really watching people adapt to damage. That does not mean every idea lands with equal force. It does not mean every choice works. But it does mean there is more happening here than the surface sometimes allows you to notice. Beneath the familiar rhythm of pursuit and escape, beneath the franchise echoes, beneath the massive set pieces, there is a story about inheritance. Not the neat kind, not the comforting kind, the brutal kind. The kind where someone else's war falls into your hands before you are ready. The kind where the future looks at you before you have even decided who you are. And maybe that is why Terminator Dark Fate deserves a careful essay instead of a quick dismissal, because some films fail by having nothing inside them. This one is different. This one has things inside it. Questions, grief, anger, legacy, reinvention, frustration. A desire to honor the past while trying to move beyond it. Sometimes those things work together. Sometimes they collide. Sometimes you can feel the film fighting against the very franchise structure that makes it possible. But even that tension says something. It shows us a movie trying to be both continuation and correction, both farewell and beginning, both tribute and reset. And that is a difficult thing to be. So in this essay, we are not going to treat that fate like a simple success or failure. We are going to look at what it reaches for. We are going to sit with the culture moment it arrived into, the burden of the Terminator name, the return of Linda Hamilton, the reshaping of the future, the emotional architecture of its characters, the action language of Tim Miller's direction. and the complicated question of what this film adds to a mythology that many people thought had already reached its perfect ending. Because Terminator 2 did feel like an ending, not just a sequel ending, a mythic ending, a door closing on fate itself. So, what does it mean to open that door again? What does it mean to say the future was saved, but only for a while? What does it mean to bring Sarah Connor back into a world that still needs warriors but has not learned how to protect them from becoming ruins? That is where our journey begins. Not with a Riv9 falling from the sky, not with a chase, not with the weapons or the spectacle, but with a world that made this return feel necessary, risky, divisive, and strangely mournful. Because before we can understand Terminator Dark Fate, we have to understand the cinematic world it was born into. A world crowded with reboots, haunted by nostalgia, hungry for legacy, and uncertain about whether the future of franchise cinema was still a promise or already a warning. The world that Terminator Dark Fate arrived into was not the world that first made the Terminator terrifying. By 2019, the fear of machines had changed shape. In 1984, the nightmare felt industrial, metallic, physical. A machine from the future could walk into a room, scan a face, and turn human life into a target. In 1991, that fear became liquid, sleek, almost supernatural. Technology was no longer only heavy and mechanical, it could flow, it could adapt, it could imitate, it could wear trust like a mask. But by the time Dark Fate reached theaters, technology was already inside daily life. It was in phones, homes, cars, cameras, search engines, recommendation systems, military drones, facial recognition, and quiet invisible algorithms shaping what people saw, bought, believed, feared, and desired. The Terminator was no longer only a fictional nightmare coming from the future. The future had entered the room slowly, politely, and with a user agreement. That is the strange burden this film carried. It was not enough anymore to say that machines might one day rise. The audience had already spent years living beside systems that watched, predicted, categorized, and influenced them. The horror had become less about a chrome skeleton stepping through fire and more about the feeling that humanity had built something it could no longer fully understand. So Dark Fate arrived at a moment when the franchise's central anxiety still mattered, but the language around that anxiety had become more complicated. And at the same time, cinema itself was changing. The late 2010s were crowded with legacy sequels, franchise revivals, soft reboots, and carefully engineered returns to beloved properties. Hollywood had become deeply invested in memory. Old stories were being reactivated, old heroes were being brought back, old endings were being reopened. Some of these returns felt generous, some felt desperate. Some felt like genuine continuations of unfinished emotional business. Others felt like brands trying to convince you that recognition was the same thing as meaning. Dark Fate belongs to that moment completely. It is a film born from the belief that the past still has power, but also from the anxiety that the past may no longer be enough. It brings back Sarah Connor. It brings back the old machine face. It restores James Cameron as a major creative presence behind the film. And yet, it also tries to move the myth forward, away from John Connor as the single center of destiny toward Dani Ramos, grace, and a new future with a new machine intelligence rising in the ashes of the old one. That choice was bold. It was also dangerous. Because Terminator 2 had become more than a sequel. It had become a sacred object in action cinema. For many people, it was the perfect closing of the myth, a film that took the fatalism of the first story and transformed it into a statement of human choice. It gave the franchise scale, emotion, spectacle, and philosophical clarity. It made destruction feel intimate. It made a machine's transformation feel heartbreaking. It made the future feel like something that could still be changed by love. So when Dark Fate positioned itself as the direct continuation of that legacy, it was stepping onto holy ground. And you can feel that pressure in the reception. Critically, the film was not rejected in the way some earlier post-Terminator 2 sequels had been. Rotten Tomatoes lists it at 70% from critics and 82% from verified audience ratings, with the critical consensus framing it as a stronger entry than the immediate predecessors. Even if it did not reach the explosive heights of the franchise's greatest work, That gap is important. It tells us that many people did find value here. They saw the energy, the returning emotional force of Linda Hamilton, the clean momentum of the chase structure, and the attempt to return the series to its harder, more urgent tone. But financially, the film was wounded almost from the beginning. Box Office Mojo reports a production budget of about $185 million, a domestic opening just above $29 million, and a worldwide total of roughly 200 to 61 million. Those numbers are not just accounting details, they are part of the story. Because when a film about the cost of the future cannot financially justify its own continuation, the industrial meaning becomes almost painfully clear. The audience may have respected the attempt, but not enough people felt the need to return. That is not only about quality, it is about fatigue. By 2010, the Terminator name had already been to several attempted reboots. Each one had tried in its own way to solve the same impossible problem. How do you continue a story whose most beloved chapter already feels complete? Some moved into future war. Some tried to rewrite timelines. Some leaned harder into spectacle. Some played with nostalgia. But every attempt carried the same shadow. The more the franchise tried to escape Terminator 2, the more it proved how difficult that escape really was. Dark Fate understood this better than most. Instead of pretending the past did not matter, it faced the past directly. But facing the past does not automatically free you from it. Sometimes it only makes the weight more visible. Sarah Connor's return was powerful precisely because she brought emotional history with her. That same history made every new choice feel like a challenge to what people had already protected in their memory. That is where the audience divide becomes emotionally interesting. Some viewers looked at Dark Fate and saw the best continuation since Judgment Day. Others saw a film that disturbed the peace of a perfect ending. Somehow come they shift toward Dani and Grace as a necessary expansion. Others felt that the film's opening act made too brutal a demand on their attachment to the older mythology. Some admired its attempt to restore urgency. Others felt the shape of this story was too familiar. Another protector, another target, another unstoppable machine, another road of survival stretching across the borderlands of fate. And honestly, both reactions reveal something true, because Dark Fate is a film trying to renew a myth while still using the bones of that myth. It wants to say the future has changed, but it still speaks in the grammar of pursuit. It wants to introduce new figures of destiny, but it knows the old faces are what bring many people into the room. It wants to be a continuation and a correction. It wants to honor a classic and challenge it. That tension does not always resolve cleanly, but it gives the film its restless identity. In a words conversation, Dark Fate was never going to become a major prestige object. It was a franchise action film released into a year dominated by louder cultural events, superhero finales, Disney's enormous theatrical reach, and the ongoing shift towards streaming attention. Vanity Fair's 2019 box office overview described Disney's dominance that year and noted Paramount's difficult position, with Dark Fate becoming its top earner despite being framed as a disappointment. That detail matters because it places the film inside an industry moment where even recognizable franchises could no longer guarantee safety. And that is maybe the most Terminator thing about its release. A film about the illusion of controlling the future arrived in an industry that was losing control of its own future. Theatrical habits were shifting. Streaming was becoming more central. Audiences were becoming more selective about which franchises deserved urgency. Familiar names still mattered, but they no longer guaranteed devotion. The old studio machine was learning that nostalgia could open the door, but it could not always carry people across the threshold. And yet, Dark Fate has developed a quieter second life. Not a massive cultural resurrection, not a sudden universal reprisal, but a slower, calmer existence among people who revisited away from opening weekend noise. On streaming and digital platforms, it sits differently. Rotten Tomatoes currently points viewers toward Paramount Plus and digital rental or purchase options, while Just Watch lists availability through several US subscription and rental platforms. Which means the film now lives in the more private space where franchise disappointment often becomes personal reassessment. That matters, because some films are punished by the size of the expectation around them. In theaters, Dark Fate had to be the savior of Terminator. At home, it can simply be a film. It can be watched for Linda Hamilton's weathered intensity, for Mackenzie Davis's physical commitment, for the hard melancholy of seeing Arnold Schwarzenegger's machine become something strangely domestic and sorrowful, for the way Natalia Reyes carries the early confusion of Dani before the story asks her to become something larger. Away from the question of whether it saved the franchise, you can finally ask what it actually does, and what it does is complicated. It speaks to a world that no longer believes any victory is permanent. It reflects an era where people inherit crises they did not create. Climate anxiety, political instability, technological surveillance, economic precarity, border tensions, generational exhaustion. These are not the literal subject of the movie, but they vibrate around it. Dark Fate is about a future that keeps coming for the young because the old systems keep failing to stay buried. That is why Dani matters before she becomes symbolic. She is not introduced as dainty, she is introduced as ordinary life interrupted. Work, family, movement through the city, the texture of a day that should have remained normal, and then suddenly history chooses her without permission. That feeling belongs very much to the world of 2019, the sense that young people are handed emergencies before they are handed stability. The sense that survival has become an inheritance. So does the film feel timeless or perfectly of its time? Maybe both, but unevenly. Its franchise mechanics feel very much of the legacy sequel era. Its digital spectacle, its large budget action drama, and its desire to reset the table all speak to 2019 Hollywood. But it's the emotional idea that fate is not a single apocalypse, but a pattern humanity keeps recreating still feels alive, maybe more alive now, because the older Terminator films feared a future where machines would become inhuman. Dark Fate fears something sadder. It fears a future where humanity keeps building new versions of the same nightmare and then asking the next generation to survive them. That is the lens we need before we step into the film itself, not as a flawless resurrection, not as a failed product only, but as a troubled, sincere, muscular, haunted legacy sequel arriving at the crossroads of cinema history and technological anxiety. It came from a world that loved the past, distrusted the future, and was no longer sure whether blockbuster mythology could still make people feel awe. And into that world came a film with an old name, a new target, a returning survivor, and a machine wearing a familiar face. Now we can finally open the film itself, Terminator. Dark Fate is a 2019 science fiction action film directed by Tim Miller. From a story shaped around the return of the franchise to the emotional line of the Terminator and Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And that detail matters before anything else. Because this is not a sequel, trying to treat every previous entry as equal weight. It is a film making a very deliberate decision about memory. It looks back at the mythology and says that the first two films are the emotional spine, the cleanest line of consequence, the place where the story of Sarah Connor, John Connor, Skynet, and the machines reached its most powerful form. Everything after that becomes, in this version of the universe, a road not taken, a timeline left behind, a possible future erased by another choice. That is a bold act of storytelling, but also a confession. It says the franchise had wandered. It says the center had been lost. It says that if Terminator was going to return again, it needed to return not only to its images, but to its original emotional pressure, the terror of being hunted, the ache of protecting someone who does not yet understand their own importance, and the awful knowledge that tomorrow is always trying to reach backward into today. At its surface, Dark Fate is a chase film. A young woman named Dani Ramos, played by Natalia Reyes, becomes the target of a new machine assassin from the future. This machine, the Rev 9, played with sharp, unsettling calm by Gabrielle Luna, is not simply another metal skeleton. It is two threads in one form, both liquid and solid, both infiltrator and brute force. It can divide itself, it can smile, it can ask questions. It can become ordinary enough to enter human spaces without disturbing them until it is already too late. sent back to protect Dani's Clays, played by Mackenzie Davis, a soldier from the future whose body has been enhanced for combat but not made invincible. That difference is important. Grace is not a machine pretending to be human. She is a human being altered until survival itself has become painful. Her strength comes with a cost. Her body burns through itself. Her power has limits. She fights like someone who knows every second has a price. And then there is Sarah Connor. Linda Hamilton returns to the role not as a nostalgic ornament, not as a ceremonial icon placed on screen so the audience can applaud recognition, but as a woman weathered by grief and hardened by a life spent waiting for machines to come back. Sarah enters this film like a wound that learned how to walk upright. She carries weapons, yes. She carries rage. She carries bitterness. But beneath all of that, she carries the deeper tragedy of someone who did everything she was supposed to do and still could not protect herself from loss. That is where Dark Fate begins to separate itself from a simple reboot, because the film is not only asking Danny to survive, it is asking Sarah to confront what survival has turned her into. It is asking Grace to measure the meaning of sacrifice when the future has already consumed her body. It is asking the familiar machine played again by Arnold Schwarzenegger to exist in a new moral space, no longer only as a tool of violence, but as something shaped by time, proximity, and the strange routines of human living. The cast gives the film its emotional architecture. Natalia Reyes plays Dani with a softness that gradually hardens into resolve. At first, she does not move like someone chosen by destiny. She moves like someone whose life is being stolen too quickly for her to understand it. That is essential. If Dani began as a symbol, she would feel abstract. Instead, she begins as a person, a worker, a daughter, a sister, someone tied to home, labor, family, ordinary rhythm. The film's entire emotional bed depends on the idea that history does not only choose warriors, sometimes it chooses people who were simply trying to get through the day. Mackenzie Davis gives Grace a physical intensity that feels both heroic and vulnerable. There is a tension in her performance that makes the character interesting. She is built for violence, but she is not comfortable inside the coast of that building. She pushes forward because she must, not because the film wants to pretend combat is glamorous. Her strength is not clean, it is medical, desperate, engineered, and because of that, every action sequence around her carries exhaustion as well as momentum. Gabriel Luna's Rev 9 works because he does not play the machine as loud evil. He plays it as efficiency wearing charm. That is more disturbing. The Rev 9 does not need to snarl. It enters systems. It reads people. It borrows authority. It turns politeness into a weapon. In an earlier age, the Terminator was frightening because it could not be reasoned with. Here, the Rev 9 is frightening because it understands enough about human behavior to move through society smoothly while remaining completely empty inside. And Arnold Schwarzenegger's presence brings the film into its strangest emotional territory. The older machine is not written as the same simple protector figure from Judgment Day. This version has carried out a terrible purpose, then been left behind by the future that created him. And in that abandonment, the film imagines an impossible transformation. Not redemption in the easy human sense, not forgiveness handed to a machine because the story needs sentiment, something colder, weirder, more unsettling. A programmed being continuing to exist after its mission, absorbing the patterns of domestic life, learning the shape of responsibility without possessing a human soul in the way we understand it. Think about that. The Terminator was once the image of fate, a walking endpoint, a metal sentence, and now Dark Fate asks what happens when fate outlives its own instruction? What happens when the weapon remains after the war has changed? Can routine become conscience? Can imitation become something close to care? Can a machine understand consequence even if it cannot feel remorse in the way a human being does? That idea is more haunting than the film sometimes has time to explore, but it is there. And when you notice it, the entire movie becomes more than its chase mechanics. At its heart, this is a story about transferred burden. In the first Terminator, Sarah Connor was an ordinary woman hunted because of a future she had not lived yet. In Judgment Day, she had become a warrior trying to prevent that future from happening. In Dark Fate, she is no longer the chosen center of history. She becomes the scar tissue of an older prophecy, forced to watch a new one form around someone else. That shift gave the film its central sadness. Dani is not simply the new Sarah. Grace is not simply the new Kyle Reese. The Rev 9 is not simply the new T-1000. The film certainly echoes those shapes, sometimes too clearly, but the emotional positions have changed. Sarah is now the survivor from a myth that did not end cleanly. Dani is the future arriving before she is ready. Grace is the proof that the future Dani may create is not painless, even if it is worth fighting for. And the older Terminator is a reminder that the past cannot be erased just because a timeline changes. So, what kind of story is this? It is a rescue mission, yes. A road movie, a border crossing thriller, a machine pursuit, a legacy sequel, a survival film. But beneath those sworn words, it is really about the inheritance of violence and the possibility of choosing responsibility anyway. The world it inhabits is one where the old apocalypse was prevented, but the deeper human pattern was not. Skynet is gone, but something else rises. The name changes. The threat adapts. Humanity still creates the conditions for its own replacement. This is not the clean triumph of Judgment Day. It is a more exhausted, more modern idea. You can defeat one version of the future, but if you do not change the instincts that built it, and another version will eventually arrive. That is why the title matters. Dark Fate, not fate as a grand prophecy carved in stone, not fate as a single inevitable event. Dark fate as the shadow that follows human history when it refuses to learn. Dark fate as the feeling that every generation keeps waking up inside problems created before they had any power to stop them. Dark fate as grief repeating in new language. And yet the film is not hopeless. That is important. The Terminator franchise at its best is never simply about doom. It is about defiance. It is about people who are told by time itself that they do not matter and then choose to matter anyway. Dark Fate continues that idea, but it makes the defiance feel more bruised, less pure, less triumphant, more aware that victory may not last forever, but still convinced that the temporary nature of victory does not make it meaningless. Should you watch this film? Yes, but with the right expectation. Do not come to it expecting the keen mythic perfection of Judgment Day. Very few action films in history can survive that comparison. Come to it instead as a wounded continuation, a film trying to restore nerve endings to a franchise that had become tangled in its own timelines. Come for Linda Hamilton because her return gives the movie a grief-struck gravity it would not have without her. Come for Mackenzie Davis because Grace gives the film its most urgent physical pulse. Come for the Rev 9 because Gabriel Luna brings a modern, socially fluent menace to the machine. Come for Arnold because the film uses his familiar presence in a stranger way than nostalgia alone would require. But most of all, come for the question beneath the action. If the future can always change, why does pain keep repeating? And if pain keeps repeating, why fight at all? Dark Fate answers not with philosophy spoken aloud, but with bodies in motion, with people choosing to protect each other, with strangers becoming allies under impossible pressure, with old wounds becoming warnings, with sacrifice becoming the one human act the machines can calculate, imitate, and weaponize, but never truly understand. That is the film introduced. A loud film with a mournful center, a sequel carrying the burden of a masterpiece, a reboot that wants to be inheritance instead of replacement, a chase movie about destiny, grief, technology, and the stubborn human refusal to let tomorrow be decided without a fight. And now that we know what it is, we can sit with what it felt like to meet it for the first time. When I first sat with this film, I expected wait before I expected surprise. That is a strange way to enter an action movie, but Terminator is not an ordinary action title. It comes with memory already attached to it. You do not press play on a Terminator film with a blank mind. You bring images with you. Sarah looking at the road ahead, a machine lowering itself into fire, the terrible glow of an artificial eye, the sound of metal beneath skin, the feeling that the future is not distant at all, but standing just outside the door, waiting for the right moment to enter. So with Dark Fate, the first feeling was not excitement, it was caution, because this franchise has trained you to protect your own attachment. It has given you greatness, then variations on greatness, then attempts to reframe greatness, then timelines footed over themselves until the emotional clarity began to blur. And when a film arrives claiming to return to the true line, to the original wound, to the direct aftermath of the story that many people considered complete, you almost instinctively hold your breath. You want it to work. But wanting is dangerous. And then the film begins with the past. Not the past as nostalgia. Not the past as a warm doorway. The past as something violent and unfinished. The opening does not invite you gently back into the world. It cuts into the mythology with a sharpness that feels almost confrontational. It says before anything else that this story will not protect your memory just because your memory is beloved. It will reach into the place where the franchise once found its cleanest ending and disturb it. That choice is difficult to sit with. Emotionally, it does something immediate. It takes away comfort. It removes the idea that the old victory can simply remain untouched, shining somewhere behind the story. And whether you agree with that choice or not, whether you feel it was brave or too severe, it changes the atmosphere of the whole film. From the beginning, Dark Fate tells you that survival in this universe does not come with permanent safety. A saved future can still be wounded. A prophecy can be erased, and grief can still arrive through another door. That is the first mood the film creates, a mood of stolen peace, and then it shifts into ordinary life with Dani Ramos. This is where the film becomes quieter before it becomes loud. We see a world of work, family, shooting, movement, small responsibilities. It matters that Dani is not introduced through grandeur. She's not framed as someone already mythic. She's living inside the everyday texture of a life that has no reason to expect apocalypse. And that ordinary beginning is one of the most important emotional anchors in the film. Because the Terminator story has always worked best when the future violates the present, not when the future is abstract, when it interrupts breakfast, work, a family conversation, a road, a factory floor, a body that thought it was safe. The early atmosphere has that familiar tension, the uncanny feeling of something wrong entering a normal environment. The Rev 9's arrival does not feel like a monster stepping onto a stage. It feels like danger learning how to pass as procedure. It asks questions. It uses the shape of authority. It moves through the world with a calm that makes the human spaces around it feel fragile. That is when the film begins to find its pulse. And then Grace arrives and the energy changes again. Grace does not enter as a graceful savior. She lands like a body thrown out of one kind of suffering into another. Her presence feels painful from the beginning. She is powerful, yes, but not comfortably powerful. There is strain in her. There is agency. The film makes you feel that her strength is borrowed against her own body, and that gives her first scenes a kind of wounded electricity. What struck me most at first was that the protectors in this film do not feel whole. Sarah is broken into purpose. Grace is mortified into usefulness. Carl is trapped inside the echo of what he was built to do. And Denny at the center of them is still intact only because the story has not finished taking from her yet. That is not a light emotional design. For all the film's blockbuster machinery, its character introductions are built around damage. Everyone who knows what is happening has already paid a price for that knowledge. Everyone who understands the future has been injured by it. Danny's innocence is not treated as weakness. It is treated as something the world is about to invade. And when Sarah finally appears, the film briefly becomes something colder and more thrilling. Not because of the weapons, not because of the entrance itself, but because Linda Hamilton carries time in her face and voice and movement. She does not return as if no years have passed. She returns as if every year has left a mark. That makes her presence feel different from ordinary nostalgia. The film is not simply saying, remember her. It is saying, look what remembering has cost her. That is where my first emotional response became more complicated because part of me was watching the action structure, recognizing familiar shapes, protector, target, hunter, escape, regrouping, revelation. But another part of me was watching Sarah Connor and feeling the sadness of a character who had become almost mythic to cinema, now re-entering the frame as someone who did not get to rest inside her own legend. There is something quietly cruel about that, and maybe also truthful. Heroes in stories often save the world and then disappear into the glow of resolution. But if they had to keep living, what would happen to them? If the nightmares came back again and again, would heroism still look noble, or would it begin to look like exhaustion? Dark fate gives Sarah that exhaustion. It lets her be bitter. It lets her be sharp. It lets her be difficult, and that made the first viewing feel less like a celebration than a reckoning. The film's atmosphere from minute one is built on motion, but underneath the motion is grief. The action moves quickly. The pacing does not linger for long before the chase begins to tighten. And yet the emotional air is heavy because the film keeps reminding you that these characters are not running from an event, they are running from a pattern. A machine comes back, a future reaches into the present. A life is marked, someone must protect, someone must sacrifice, the details change, but the shape returns. That repetition could have felt empty. Sometimes, honestly, it almost does. But on that first sit, the thing that kept the film alive for me was the feeling that the repetition itself was part of the sadness. Dark Fate is not simply repeating the old Terminator structure because it has no imagination. It is also showing how history repeats through new victims. It is showing how one generation's trauma becomes another generation's emergency. It is showing that changing fate once does not mean humanity has learned how to stop creating darker futures. Think about it this way. The original films had a clean emotional question: can the future be changed? Dark Fate asks a more tired question: what if it can be changed, but only into another version of the same fear? That is a much more modern sadness. And that sadness stayed with me more than any single set piece. The first viewing felt like watching a film trying to outrun not only its killer machine, but its own inheritance. It wants to move forward. It wants to build Danny into the future. It wants Grace to matter beyond function. It wants Sarah to become more than a returning icon. But it also knows that every step forward is measured against a past that action cinema has never fully escaped. So, what I expected was a machine movie. What I found was a Bruce legacy film about people who have been forced into history before they were ready. And once that feeling settled, the story stopped being only about whether the Reverend Nine could be defeated. It became about whether these characters could survive the meaning of being chosen by a future that never asked permission. That is where the film begins to open, not as perfection, not as pure reinvention, but as an experience of pursuit, grief, memory, and reluctant inheritance, a story where the chase is only the surface and beneath it, every character is running from the life they were supposed to have. The story of Terminator Dark Fate begins with the feeling that peace is always more fragile than people want to believe. That is the emotional ground beneath everything. Before the machines move, before the chase begins, before the film becomes noise and speed and impact, there is a simple truth sitting underneath the frame. Someone once fought to change the future, and yet the future still found a way to become dangerous again. The film does not ease you into that idea. It opens by disturbing the mythology almost immediately. It states the sense of closure that once seemed sacred and places grief inside it. And whether that choice works for you or not, it gives the rest of the movie a better foundation. Dark Fate is not beginning from hope. It is beginning from the wreckage left after hope was tested too harshly. From there, the story moves into Dani Ramos's world, and this shift is essential. Dani's life is not grand, it is not mythic. She is not introduced with the blow of destiny around her. She lives inside the ordinary machinery of family, labor, routine, and responsibility. She wakes into a day that should belong to her. She moves through familiar spaces. She cares about the people close to her. She exists in a world where survival means work, care, small sacrifices, and the everyday pressure of keeping life moving. That ordinariness matters because the Terminator story only becomes powerful when the future violates something recognizably human. If the target feels abstract, the chase becomes mechanical. But if the target has a home, a brother, a workplace, a rhythm, a life that feels interrupted rather than invented for plot, then the machine's arrival becomes more than danger, it becomes invasion. The future does not enter Dani's world like an announcement. It enters like an error in reality. Someone familiar is not familiar. A normal moment turns wrong. A trusted shape becomes threatening. And suddenly, the day she thought she understood no longer belongs to her. That is where the Reverend Nine becomes frightening. Not because it is the most physically impossible machine the franchise has ever imagined, though its abilities are terrifying. The deeper fear is how easily it moves through human systems. It knows how to speak just enough. It knows how to appear official. It understands that people often obey tone, uniform, paperwork, confidence. It uses society's own habits as a doorway. That is very different from pure brute force. The Rev9 is not just a killer. It is infiltration turned into a body. And that makes Tenny's early confusion feel painfully believable. She does not know the genre she is inside it. She does not understand that the future has marked her. She is still trying to interpret impossible events through normal human logic. Something is wrong, someone is lying, someone she trusts is in danger, her mind is trying to catch up while the film is already pulling her forward. That delay between what the audience understands and what Danny can accept creates the emotional tension of the opening act. Then Grace arrives, and Grace changes the temperature of film immediately. She is not calm in the way a machine would be calm. She is focused, urgent, wounded, nearly feral in her purpose. She has the intensity of someone who has rehearsed this danger in nightmares before arriving inside it. Her body is enhanced, but the film never lets that enhancement feel free. It has a cost. Her strength burns through her. Her speed does not make her invulnerable. Every time she pushes herself, you sense the debt her body is collecting. That makes her protection feel different from the older franchise protectors. Grace is not the machine learning humanity, and she is not a romantic soldier from the future stepping into the past with tragic devotion. She is something else. She is a person whose humanity has been modified by war but not erased by it. She has been made into a weapon because the future demanded it, and yet she is still emotional, impatient, protective, frightened, loyal, and alive inside all that engineering. The chase that follows is where the film begins to turn story into physical experience. That fate moves quickly, sometimes almost too quickly. But at its best, the pacing creates the feeling of being pulled into a survival rhythm before anyone has time to grieve properly. Dani loses the shape of her normal life in fragments. One moment she is trying to understand what is happening. The next she is running. The next she is witnessing a level of violence and impossibility that no ordinary person could process clearly. The film does not pause to let her become heroic. It lets her be overwhelmed first. That is important. Because heroism means more when confusion comes before courage. Dani is not brave because she understands everything. She is brave because she continues even where she does not. She keeps moving through shock, fear, and grief. She does not immediately become a symbol. She remains a person whose life has been stolen and whose only choice is to keep breathing long enough for meaning to arrive later. And then Sarah Connor enters this story like a storm that has learned discipline. Her arrival is one of the film's strongest emotional jolts because it does not feel keenly celebratory. Yes, there is the thrill of recognition. Yes, there is the force of seeing Linda Hamilton recreate this character with such heart and presence, but the feeling is not simple nostalgia. Sarah does not come back knowing with heroic warmth. She comes back carrying decades of ruin. She appears as someone who has turned pain into preparation and preparation into identity. Her role in the story is fascinating because she understands Dani's terror before Dani understands it herself. Sarah knows the shape of this nightmare. She knows what it means to be hunted by a future you did not choose. She knows how absurd the truth sounds when it first enters the life of an ordinary person. She knows that disbelief can get people hurt, and yet Sarah is not gentle with that knowledge. She is too damaged to be purely nurturing. She protects, but her protection has teeth. She helps, but she does not soften the world for Dani. She has lived too long with machines to pretend comfort is useful. This creates one of the film's most interesting emotional dynamics. Dani needs answers. Grace has a mission. Sarah has reach. All three women are moving together, but not from the same place. Dani is surviving the beginning of her trauma. Grace is fulfilling a future promise. Sarah is fighting the afterlife of her own story. Their alliance is not instantly harmonious, and that is why it has texture. The film understands, at least in its better moments, that shared danger does not automatically create shared understanding. People can be on the same side and still hurt each other with what they do not know. Grace and Sarah especially carry a sharp tension. Grace comes from a future where the threat has a different name and a different history. Sarah comes from a past defined by Skynet, judgment, and the old war she spent her life trying to prevent. Each woman believes she knows what matters because each has been shaped by catastrophe. Grace looks at Sarah and sees someone useful but outdated, a warrior from an erased apocalypse. Sarah looks at Grace and sees another messenger from the future, another body sent backward to drag an innocent person into destiny. Neither is entirely wrong. That is what gives their conflict weight. Dark Fate is not only staging a generational handoff, it is staging a collision between forms of trauma. Sarah's pain belongs to a future that was stopped. Grace's pain belongs to a future that replaced it. Dani stands between them, not yet fully aware of how much history is trying to claim her body. This triangle is where the story becomes more emotionally interesting than the basic chase structure suggests. As the group moves across borders, through hidden spaces, military systems, desert routes, detention environments, and temporary shelters, the film becomes a story about people who cannot stay anywhere. That constant movement matters. There is no true home once the future has chosen you. Every place becomes temporary. Every safe room becomes a waiting room before danger returns. Every vehicle is not transportation but delay. The characters are not traveling toward comfort. They are traveling toward the next decision. This is where the pacing works as more than action rhythm. The film moves the way panic moves. Fast, fragmented, breathless, sometimes messy. It really allows rest because Ref 9 is not a villain that can be emotionally negotiated with. It is pressure. It is recurrence. It is the future refusing to stop. And because it can move through human institutions so effectively, the world around Dani begins to feel less like protection and more like a maze of systems the machine can exploit. That is one of the film's strongest modern ideas. In the earlier Terminator films, technology was frightening because it was becoming autonomous. In Dark Fate, technology is frightening because systems already exist around people and the machine knows how to use them. Borders, surveillance, law enforcement, databases, communication networks, authority structures, all the things that are supposed to organize the world become tools that can be turned against the vulnerable. The film does not lecture this idea. It simply lets the chase pass through it. Dani's experience becomes the emotional center because every system she enters seems too slow, too confused, or too indifferent to protect her. And that is painfully human. Many people know the feeling of being trapped inside systems that cannot see the emergency they are living through. The future may be science fiction here, but the fear of being processed instead of protected is real. Dani becomes a person caught between enormous forces, a machine from tomorrow, a soldier from tomorrow, a survivor from yesterday, and present day institutions that do not understand any of it. Through this, the film keeps asking what makes someone worth saving. At first, the answer seems to belong to old franchise logic. Someone is important because of what they will one day create, birth, lead, or change. Someone matters because the future says so. But Dark Fate slowly begins to press against that idea. Dani matters before any revelation. She matters because she is alive, because she loves, because she grieves, because her life has meaning before mythology assigns her a role. The future may have a reason to target her, but the film's emotional reason to care about her must come before that, and in the best moments it does. Grace's devotion to Dani also deepens the story. At first, Grace seems driven by mission: protect the target, stop the machine, keep moving. But there is an emotional intensity beneath her duty that suggests something more personal, something rooted in memory rather than order. She does not protect Dani like a soldier guarding an asset. She protects her like someone preserving the center of her own past. You feel that Grace's loyalty comes from somewhere deeper than command, even before the film explains it fully. That mystery gives her performance a strong internal pull. Mackenzie Davis plays Grace as someone who cannot afford emotional softness, but cannot fully hide it either. She is impatient with confusion because every delay feels dangerous. She is harsh because she has lived in a world where gentleness may not have survived. But when the film lets her look at Dani, there is something else there: reverence, pain, gratitude. The burden of having come back not only to save a person, but to protect the meaning that person gave to her life. Sarah, meanwhile, becomes the film's bitter witness. She watches Dani's story begin and recognizes the shape of her own. That recognition does not make her tender at first, it makes her angry. Because to Sarah, this is not destiny blooming. It is another young life being hunted by history. It is another woman being told she matters because a machine wants her removed. It is another version of the nightmare wearing new skin. And this is the part I keep coming back to. Sarah's anger is not only at the machines, it is at the repetition. It is at the universe for finding another way to continue the pattern. It is at fate for changing names without changing its appetite. It is at herself perhaps because survival did not become peace. She destroyed one future and still wakes up inside a world where machines keep returning. What does victory mean if the wound keeps reopening? What does purpose become when it never releases you? That is why the film's middle section works best when the characters are allowed to talk around their pain rather than simply run from danger. They do not need to explain everything directly. In fact, the film is often more powerful when they do not. Sarah's face tells you enough. Grace's collapsing body tells you enough. Danny's silence after loss tells you enough. The story is strongest when it trusts that grief does not always speak in complete sentences. Then the older Terminator enters the journey, and the film takes its strangest turn. This is not just a familiar face returning, it is the story forcing Sarah to stand in the same space as the shape of her deepest wound. The machine that once represented inevitability now exists in an almost absurdly domestic form, surrounded by ordinary human details. The film asks you to accept something difficult, that a being created for one purpose can continue after that purpose, and in continuing can become changed by the routines of life. That idea should not be easy, and the film is wise enough, at least partly, not to make it entirely easy. Sarah does not forgive because the story needs warmth. She does not look at this machine and suddenly find comfort. Her rage remains justified. Her disgust remains human. But the presence of Kirk complicates the old mythology. It asks whether choice can exist inside programming once the original command has ended. It asks whether learning behavior is the same as understanding. It asks whether responsibility can emerge from imitation. For Danny and Grace, Carl is useful. For Sarah, he is unbearable. That emotional imbalance gives the group a charged, uneasy energy as they prepare for what comes next. They are not a family, not really. They are a temporary formation created by necessity. A grieving survivor, a future soldier, a young woman being hunted, and a machine trying to act outside the shadow of what it once did. That is a strange collection of beings, but somehow it contains the whole Terminator mythology in miniature: mother, soldier, target, machine, future, past, choice, consequence. And as the Revenant continues closing in, the film's emotional question sharpens. Can survival become more than escape? Because running is not enough forever. The story begins as a chase, but it cannot remain only a chase. At some point, the hunted must decide how to stand. Danny must move from shock toward agency. Grace must face the limits of her body. Sarah must decide whether protecting someone new can mean anything beyond extending the same old war. Carl must confront whether responsibility can ever answer for what he was made to do. This is where Dark Fate's story as experience becomes less about plot and more about pressure. Every character is being compressed by time. The Rev 9 does not simply threaten their lives. It forces them to become honest. Danny cannot remain only afraid. Grace cannot remain only the protector. Sarah cannot remain only the weapon grief created. Carl cannot remain only the machine hiding inside domestic routine. The future is coming too fast for any of them to stay incomplete. And that is why, even when the film echoes familiar franchise beats, the emotional journey still carries force. Because the characters are not just trying to stop a machine, they are trying to understand what they are willing to become in order to stop it. Dani is being pulled toward a truth about herself. Grace is moving toward the full cost of her mission. Sarah is being pulled toward the possibility that her story did not end with loss. Card is being pulled toward the final meaning of responsibility. The film is character driven and world driven at the same time. The world creates the danger, but the characters give that danger meaning. Without the future war, Danny's journey would not have its scale. Without Danny's ordinary humanity, the future war would feel empty. Without Sarah, the film would lack memory. Without Grace, it would lack urgency. Without Carl, it would lack its strangest question about change. And without the Revenant, all of them would have time to avoid becoming who the story requires them to be. That is the function of the machine. It removes delay, it turns identity into emergency. And just before the film reveals the deepest truth about why Danny matters, it reaches a point where the old explanation no longer feels sufficient. We think we understand the pattern because we have seen versions of it before. A protector arrives, a target runs, a machine hunts. The future depends on someone yet to come. But Dark Fate is preparing to turn that expectation slightly and emotionally. That turn matters because it changes Danny from a vessel of destiny into something more immediate, more personal, and more powerful. And here is where the film shifts completely. The making of Terminator Dark Fate begins with a desire that is both creative and almost emotional to bring the franchise back to the branch where it once felt most alive. That is why the film's production story matters. It was not simply another studio trying to extend a recognizable name. It was built around the idea of restoration. James Cameron returned as a major creative presence. Tim Miller stepped in as director after the success of Deadpool, and the film deliberately positioned itself as a continuation of The Terminator and Terminator 2 rather than the later sequel path. According to reporting and interviews around the release, this was the first Terminator film in more than 25 years to bring Linda Hamilton back as Sarah Connor while also involving Cameron creatively again. And that fact reshapes the way you see the whole movie. Because Dark Fate is not trying to pretend it comes from nowhere. It comes from negotiation between past and present, between creator and new director, between myth and market, between the desire to honor what came before and the need to make the story feel alive for someone watching in 2019. You can feel that negotiation in almost every major choice: the return of Sarah, the removal of certain timeline baggage, the new future threat, the handoff to Dani, the familiar shape of the chase, the emotional attempt to make old wounds matter again. The first fascinating thing is that the film was reportedly still evolving as a script even after some of the action architecture had already been decided. Tim Miller said in an interview that they were still writing the screenplay after action scenes had been planned. That detail could sound chaotic if you had it casually, but it also explains part of the film's personality. Dark Fate often feels like a movie where the set pieces have massive confidence, while the emotional connective tissue is fighting to catch up and deepen them. Once you know that, the film's moment makes more sense. The action is not decoration, it is the skeleton. The character writing has to wrap itself around that skeleton and find places where grief, legacy, and identity can breathe. The second fascinating thing is Linda Hamilton's return. Hamilton had not played Sarah Connor in a live-action feature for decades, and according to profiles around the film, she trained intensely for roughly a year to return to the role. Clamor described her physical preparation at age 62 as a demanding process, and other production accounts note weapons and combat preparation as part of rebuilding Sarah's screen presence. But the real meaning of that training is not simply that she could hold weapons convincingly or move through action beats with authority. The meaning is that Sarah's body had to look like a life lived under pressure. That changes how you see her first entrance. She does not feel like an actor revisiting an old costume. She feels like someone whose entire body has been reorganized by survival. Her posture has memory in it, her walk has bitterness, her stillness has discipline. When she appears, the film gains a kind of credibility that cannot be generated by digital spectacle. It comes from time, from age, from refusal, from the sense that Sarah Connor did not simply survive the earlier films, she kept surviving long after we stopped watching. The third fascinating thing is Mackenzie Davis's grace, because the role required a different kind of physical language. Grace is not written as a traditional unstoppable action figure. She is powerful, but her power is unstable. She is fast, but the speed costs her. She is enhanced, but still painfully human. That means the performance cannot be only muscular. It has to carry strain. Interviews and profiles around the release emphasized Davis's place as the film's new future sun protector and the way the movie centered a trio of women against a new technological threat. And once you understand that, Grace's scenes begin to play differently. Her combat is not just cool movement, it is a body being spent. Every burst of strength feels like an advance taken from a future bill. Every collapse matters because the film is reminding you that this is not invincibility. This is sacrifice engineered into muscle and nerve. That is why Grace works best when the film lets you see the damage after the action. The character is not heroic because she is untouched. She is heroic because she keeps going while being visibly used up. The fourth fascinating thing is the film's geography. Principal Petrovay is widely listed as taking place across Hungary, Spain, and the United States, with Spanish locations used for portions of the film's Mexico and Guatemala settings. That production reality gives the film an interesting constructed world quality. It is not a documentary like Mexico. It is a cinematic borderland assembled through international locations, industrial spaces, roads, detention centers, military architecture, and temporary zones of escape. And that reshapes the way you see the world of the movie. Dark Fate is constantly about displacement. Dani is displaced from home. Grace is displaced from time. Sarah is displaced from the ending she thought she had earned. Carl is displaced from the future that traded him. Even the film's production geography becomes part of that feeling, whether intentionally or not. The characters move through spaces that feel transitional, borrowed, unstable. No place has the comfort of permanence. Everything feels like a corridor between one danger and the next. The fifth fascinating thing is the collaboration itself, because it was not fictionless. James Cameron was reportedly heavily involved in shaping the film in post production, and he later described the editing process as full of intense creative disagreement with Tim Miller. That fact matters because Dark Fate feels like a film made by strong competing instincts. Miller brings momentum, impact, speed, and a modern action sensibility. Cameron's presence pulls the film back toward myth, structure, and the emotional legacy of the first two films. The result is not always seamless, but it is alive with tension. You can feel that in Carl especially. The idea of an older Terminator living beyond its mission has a camera-like fascination with machines learning through proximity to human life. But the way the film stages him, with a dry oddness and blunt action utility, also belongs to the sharper rhythm of a modern blockbuster. The character becomes strange because the production itself seems to be asking two questions at once. Can this machine become meaningful? And can the movie keep moving fast enough that you do not stop too long on the impossible moral discomfort of that idea? That is the larger production story of Dark Fate. It was built not from purity but from pressure. A returning creator, a new director, a returning icon, a new protector, a new lead, a new machine, a massive franchise history, a blockbuster budget, a fanbase divided between hope and suspicion, and inside all that, the filmmakers tried to make something that could move like a chase film while carrying the emotional burden of a myth that many people believed had already ended perfectly. That is why the film sometimes feels muscular and wounded at the same time. The production facts do not merely decorate the movie, they explain its pulse. The action-first development helps explain the confidence of its movement and the occasional thinness around certain relationships. Hamilton's preparation explains why Sarah feels physically and emotionally carved out of time. Davis's role explains why Grace's body becomes one of the film's main storytelling tools. The international production geography explains the film's restless sense of displacement, and the creative tension behind the edit explains why the final movie feels like a machine assembled from competing hopes. Cinema rarely comes from one clean intention. It comes from compromise, argument, weather, bodies, budgets, injuries, revisions, instincts, egos, memories, and accidents that somehow become images. And when you watch Terminator Dark Fate with that in mind, you can see the film less as a simple product and more as an artifact of struggle, a movie about trying to change the future, made by people trying to rescue a past that refused to stay quiet. What Terminator Dark Fate achieves best is not reinvention. That may sound like criticism at first, but it is not entirely. Reinvention is difficult when a story carries this much mythology. The film does not truly escape the old Terminator structure. It knows the road, it knows the shape. Someone is marked by the future. Someone is sent back to protect. Something inhuman keeps coming. The present becomes a battlefield for a tomorrow that has not happened yet. But what Darfit does achieve is a return of emotional texture. It brings the franchise back to bodies under pressure, to faces that carry fear, to protection that feels costly, to action that is not only about impact but exhaustion. It remembers that Terminator works best when the machine is frightening because human life feels fragile beside it. The spectacle matters, but the humanity has to matter first. Without that, the chase becomes machinery, chasing machinery. And this film, at its strongest, understands that. Linda Hamilton is the deepest achievement here. Sarah Connor could have returned as a symbol only. She could have been written as a monument to the older films, a figure brought back so the audience could feel the comfort of recognition. But Hamilton does something harsher and more interesting. She plays Sarah as someone who has been left alive too long inside the aftermath of her own legend. There is no softness in her at first because softness has become dangerous. There is no easy warmth because warmth was taken from her. She moves through the movie like a person who has turned grief into a system. Weapons, warnings, numbers, routines, preparation. These are not just action movie details. They are the architecture of a life that never healed. And the one thing that proves it completely is not simply an action beat. It is the way Sarah reacts when she is forced into proximity with the old machine face again. That is where Hamilton's performance becomes more than dumbness. Her anger is not theatrical. It feels stored. It feels old. It has the density of something carried every day until it becomes part of the body. She does not need to explain the wound because the wound has already shaped her. When she looks at Carl, you can feel history pressing against the present. You can feel that for Sarah this is not science fiction. It is personal reality returning in the most unbearable form. That is performance as memory. Mackenzie Davis gives the film its physical nerve. Grace is written as a protector, but Davis refuses to make her cleanly heroic. Her body language is urgent, tense, almost allergic to delay. She does not move like someone enjoying power. She moves like someone rationing herself. Every burst of strength feels dangerous because the performance keeps reminding you that Grace is not built to last forever. She is not a superhero. She is a human body modified for a war that has already taken too much from her. What works beautifully is the contradiction inside her. She is sharp, impatient, and sometimes emotionally closed. But beneath that, there is devotion. The film lets you sense that Grace is not only protecting Dani because a mission told her to. She's protecting a person who means something foundational to her future self. That gives her intensity a second layer. She is not fighting for an abstract destiny. She is fighting for the person who have make her life meaningful in a broken world. Natalia Reyes has a quieter talent, and it is easy to underrate. Dani has to begin as ordinary without becoming bland. She has to be frightened without becoming passive. She has to transform without the transformation, feeling like a switch being flipped. Reyes gives Dani a grounded sincerity that helps the story hold together. Her early scenes are not about grandeur, they are about confusion, care, loss, and moral instinct. She does not become important because the plot announces her importance. She becomes important because the film slowly reveals that her compassion is not separate from leadership. It is the beginning of it. That is one of the screenplay's strongest ideas. Dark Fate understands, at least in concept, that leadership does not always begin with dominance. Sometimes it begins with the refusal to let people become disposable. Dani's strength is not that she becomes harder than everyone else. It is that she keeps recognizing people as people even while the world is turning them into targets, soldiers, tools, or sacrifices. That gives her eventual role emotional logic. The future does not need her because she is the strongest fighter in the room. It needs her because she can become the kind of person others choose to follow. Gabriel Luna's Reverend 9 is another major achievement because his performance does not chase the exact shadow of Arnold Schwarzenegger or Robert Patrick. That would have been a mistake. Instead, Luna plays the machine as socially fluent emptiness. He is polite when politeness is useful, calm when calm opens doors, forceful only when force becomes efficient. There is something disturbing about how easily he can pass through ordinary spaces. He does not always look like a monster entering society. Sometimes he looks like society giving the monster permission to move forward. That is what makes him modern. The Rev9 weaponizes trust in institutions. He uses authority, procedure, and human hesitation. He understands that people are trained to respond to confidence. That makes him feel connected to the age that produced the film. He is not only advanced technology, he is manipulation with a human face. Arnold Schwarzenegger's achievement is stranger. Carl should not work as well as he does. The idea is almost absurd on paper. A Terminator, after completing its mission, continues living among humans and gradually forms routines that resemble responsibility. In the wrong tone, this could become parody. In the wrong emotional framing, it could become cheap forgiveness. But Schwarzenegger plays Carl with a quiet, flattened sincerity that keeps the character suspended between comedy, tragedy, and unease. The film does not fully solve the moral problem of Carl, but it makes the problem interesting. His presence asks whether behavior can become meaning. If a machine performs care long enough, what is that care? If it protects people, supports a household, understands consequences, and chooses to help prevent future harm, does that make it changed? Or only better programmed by experience? The film does not answer it cleanly, and that uncertainty is part of what makes Carl memorable. He is not human, but he has been altered by human proximity. He is not forgiven, but he becomes useful. He is not redeemed in any simple spiritual sense, but he moves toward responsibility. The writing, at its best, is more thoughtful than its structure first suggests. The plot is familiar, but the emotional arrangement is not empty. Each major character represents a different relationship to fate. Dani is fate arriving before identity. Grace is fate after sacrifice. Sarah is fate after loss. Carl is fate after purpose. Tarak 9 is fate without emotion, without hesitation, without mercy. Put them together, and the film becomes a conversation about what the future does to different kinds of beings. That is what makes the screenplay more than functional. It is not only moving pieces across an action board, it is asking how people live after being turned into instruments by history. Sarah was turned into a warrior. Grace was turned into an enhanced soldier. Dani is almost turned into a symbol before she has time to grieve. Car was created as a weapon and then left with the consequences of existence. Every major figure is fighting against the role assigned to them. Visually, Tim Miller's direction is strongest when it emphasizes movement and physical impact. This is not a quiet film in the traditional sense. It does not always pause long enough for its own most interesting ideas, but the action has clarity of purpose. The factory escape, the highway pursuit, the detention center movement, the aircraft sequence, and the final confrontation all work as stages of pressure. Each set piece asks the characters to lose another layer of safety. First home, then public space, then institutional shelter, then the sky, then finally the body itself. The visual language is often built around exposure. Characters are constantly being pulled out of places where they should be protected. A workplace becomes unsafe, a road becomes a trap, a border facility becomes penetrable, a plane becomes temporary ground. The final industrial space becomes almost mythic, metal and mortar and impact, turning the human body into something small but stubborn against machinery. And that is where the film connects back to the franchise's visual soul. Terminator has always loved the image of the human body against impossible force, not because it worships suffering, but because it uses physical endurance as proof of choice. In Dark Fate, bodies are bruised, drained, thrown, repaired, pushed past limits. Gracie's body becomes the most obvious example, but Sarah's aging body matters just as much. Dani's body matters because it begins unprepared and gradually learns the posture of resistance. Even Kat's artificial body matters because it carries history like damage. The score and sound do important, if sometimes understated, work. Dark Fate cannot escape the ghost of the original Terminator rhythm. That metallic pulse is part of the franchise's bloodstream, but the film also uses sound to create urgency through impact, breath, alarms, engines, collapsing metal, and the frightening smoothness of the Rev 9's movement. The music often enters not to tell you how to feel emotionally, but to tighten the machinery around the characters. Silence carries a different function. When the film becomes quiet, it often reveals what the action is protecting. Sarah's silence is full of grief. Clay's silence is full of withheld truth. Denny's silence is full of shock becoming resolve. Carl's silence is the strangest of all because it feels like calculation trying to resemble contemplation. That is what this film achieves when it is working. It restores the idea that action can carry emotion through pressure. It gives Sarah Connor a return that feels wounded rather than decorative. It gives Grace a protector role built on bodily cost. It gives Sunny a leadership arc rooted in empathy rather than simple toughness. It gives the machine trait a modern social intelligence. And it gives Arnold's familiar figure a strange final question about responsibility after violence. Dark Fate does not reach the mythic purity of the franchise's greatest moments, but it does something worth noticing. It takes an old story about machines and makes the most interesting thing human damage again. It remembers that the future is frightening, not because technology is powerful, but because people are vulnerable, unfinished, grieving, and still willing to stand between each other and the dark. For a film this loud, Terminator, Dark Fate is often most revealing when nobody is speaking. That may sound strange because this is a movie built from pursuit, impact, engines, gunfire, collapsing metal, and bodies thrown through impossible danger. It does not present itself as quiet cinema. It does not ask you to watch still rooms for minutes at a time. Its rhythm is urgent, its design is muscular, its story keeps moving because the machine keeps coming. And yet, here is what I keep returning to. The emotional truth of this film often lives in the pauses between the action, not in speeches, not in explanations, in the places where characters are too tired, too wounded, too angry, or too afraid to say the thing directly. Sarah Connor's silence is the deepest silence in the film. It is not empty. It is crowded. Every quiet moment around her feels filled with years we did not see, years of preparation, years of mourning, years of messages arriving like cruel reminders that the future was still not finished with her. Sarah does not need to explain herself constantly because Linda Hamilton let silence become biography. The way she looks at a room before entering it, the way she measures people before trusting them, the way she keeps emotional distance like it is another weapon. These choices tell us that Sarah has not simply lived after trauma. She has built her life around preventing trauma from surprising her again. But of course, that is impossible. No one can prepare enough to become safe from memory. That is why her stillness is so powerful. Sarah is a character who has turned emotion into survival, but whenever the film allows her to be still, the grief catches up. You can feel the human being underneath the soldier, the mother underneath the myth, the person underneath the legend everyone else sees. What this film understands, at least in those moments, is that pain does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it sits beside you. Sometimes it tightens the face. Sometimes it becomes the way someone refuses to relax, even in a room where no machine is visible. Grace has a different kind of silence. Her silence is not old like Sarah's. It is guarded, pressurized, full of information she cannot release too early. She has come from a future where tenderness has likely become dangerous, and so her quietness feels like discipline. She does not waste words because every second matters, but beneath that tactical restraint there is something deeply emotional. Grace carries memories of Dani that Dani does not yet have. She carries a relationship that exists in one direction only. She knows a version of Dani shaped by war, leadership, and survival, while the Dani in front of her is still at the beginning of that becoming. Think about what that means. Grace is standing beside someone who changed her life, but that person has not become that person yet. So when Grace looks at Dani without explaining everything, the silence becomes almost tragic. It holds gratitude, loyalty, urgency, and grief all at once. She is protecting not only Dani's body, but the future meaning Dani gave her. And because she cannot simply unfold that truth too soon, her silence becomes a kind of emotional time travel. It is the future pressing its hand against the present without fully revealing itself. Dani's silence is the silence of a person whose life has been interrupted faster than language can process. In the beginning, she does not have the vocabulary for what is happening to her. How could she? The world has become impossible. A family ship has become danger. A workday has become a battlefield. A stranger is telling her to run from a machine sent by a future she has never imagined. In those early moments, silence is not weakness, it is shock. It is the mind trying to protect itself from too much truth arriving at once. But as the film continues, Dani's silence changes. It begins as confusion and becomes attention. She watches Sarah. She watches Grace. She watches how fear turns people into weapons. She watches how sacrifice is treated almost as currency in this war. And slowly, without needing a grand declaration every time, she begins to understand that leadership is not born from knowing everything. It is born from seeing people clearly when the world wants to reduce them to functions. That is why some of Dani's strongest moments are not the loudest ones. They are the moments where she absorbs what has happened and does not turn away. The camera may not always hold long enough for the full emotional weight to land, but the idea is there. Dani is learning through silence before she leads through action. Car's silence is the strangest silence in the film, because with Car, silence is not grief in the human sense. It is not trauma in the human sense. It is a machine occupying the outer shape of contemplation, and that makes every quiet moment around him unsettling. When he speaks about the life he has built, the film moves close to dark absurdity, but when he is quiet, the question becomes more disturbing. Is there anything inside that quiet? Is there remorse or only recognition of consequence? Is there care or only learned behavioral pattern? Is there responsibility or only a machine adapting after its mission ended? Cinema rarely tries this inside a franchise action film. A machine sitting in domestic quiet, surrounded by the evidence of ordinary life, becomes one of the film's most uncanny images. The old Terminator body no longer belongs fully to war, but it also does not belong fully to home. He exists between purposes. His silence is the sound of programming after command. Something remains, something has changed, but the film wisely leaves discomfort inside that change. The film also communicates through what it chooses not to show. It does not show every year of Sarah's grief. It lets us feel the absence instead. It does not show every moment of Grace's future. It gives us enough fragments to understand that the world she came from has shaped her body and spirit. It does not show Dani gradually becoming the future leader in a long, detailed arc. Instead, it places the seed of that leadership in her present-day compassion and lets us connect the line ourselves. These omissions matter because showing everything can sometimes make a myth smaller. The unseen parts create scale. Sarah's missing years become a shadow behind her. Grace's future becomes a wound we only glimpse. Dani's destiny becomes more powerful because it is not fully mapped out. Even the old war, the erased Skynet future remains like a ghost behind the new one. The film's silence around these spaces allows the franchise to feel larger than the plot in front of us. And visually, empty space often becomes emotional space. The road after a chase, the pause before another attack, the temporary shelter where no one is truly safe. The desert-like stretches where the characters seem suspended between past and future. These are not just transitions, they are breaths. They remind us that the characters are not only moving through geography, they are moving through aftermath. Dark Fate could have used more of this restraint. That is true. It sometimes rushes past its own most interesting quiet moments because the demands of blockbuster pacing pull it forward. But when the film does slow down, even briefly, you can feel the deeper movie inside it, a film about people who have been damaged by futures they did not ask for. A film about silence as survival, silence as memory, silence as withheld truth, silence as the only place where grief can exist without being turned into exposition. In the end, the machines are frightening because they do not need silence, they do not sit with loss, they do not hesitate before memory, they do not pause because something hurts. They move toward purpose with perfect emptiness. Humans pause, humans look away, humans remember, humans carry what cannot be said. And in Terminator Dark Fate, that difference is everything. Where Terminator Dark Fate falls short is not in its lack of feeling. That is important to say first. This is not a hollow film in the way some franchise continuations can be hollow. It has emotional ideas, it has performers who bring weight to those ideas, it has images and situations that genuinely understand the sadness of legacy. But the problem is that the film does not always give its own strongest ideas enough space to become fully alive. It often knows what is interesting. Then it runs past it. The first major wound is familiarity. Dark Fate wants to restart the Terminator myth for a new generation, but it does so by walking very close to the original structure. A person is targeted, a protect arrives from the future, a machine pursues with relentless focus, the hunted group escapes through a chain of increasingly dangerous set pieces. The older mythology returns to guide the new one. This structure works because it is primal, but it also creates a limit. The film is trying to tell you that the future has changed, while the shape of the story keeps reminding you how much has not changed. That tension can be meaningful, but it can also feel safe. And for a film called Dark Fate, safety is sometimes the wrong texture. The movie makes one extremely bold narrative choice early on, then becomes structurally cautious afterward. It shakes the mythology, but then it rebuilds the experience with familiar materials. That leaves the film caught between risk and comfort. It wants the emotional shock of a new direction, but it also wants the security of the chase formula audiences already know. The second problem is that Dani's transformation could have used more room. Natalia Reyes gives Dani sincerity and emotional grounding, but the screenplay asks her to travel a long distance in a relatively compressed time. She begins as an ordinary young woman thrown into catastrophe, and the film gradually reveals that her future importance is not what some viewers may first assume. That is a strong idea. It gives Dani agency and avoids reducing her only to someone else's future. But the movie moves so quickly that her inner shift sometimes feels more stated than fully lived. We understand the concept, we don't always get enough of the process, and process matters, especially in a film about becoming. If Dani is meant to grow into someone who can inspire resistance, we need to feel not only that she has the capacity, but that the film has watched that capacity awaken through choices, failures, moral tests, and moments of leadership before the revelation arrives. Some of that is there. Her compassion is there. Her instinct to protect is there. Her refusal to treat others as disposable is there. But the film's speed prevents those qualities from accumulating as deeply as they could. Clay's too is powerful but underexplored. Mackenzie Davis gives the character such physical urgency that you can feel a larger story behind her immediately, but that larger story remains mostly glimpsed. Trace comes from a future that sounds brutal, desperate, and emotionally rich with possibility. Her body carries evidence of that world. Her devotion to Dani carries mystery. Her pain suggests history, yet the film gives us only fragments before using her primarily inside the chase. That is not a failure of performance, it is a failure of space. Trace could have carried an entire film. Her enhancement, her relationship to vulnerability, her memories of Dani, her future war, her sense of identity after being physically modified for survival. All of this has depth. Dark Fate touches these ideas, but it rarely lasts with them long enough for the emotional full weight to gather. The result is a character who feels memorable and slightly unfinished at the same time. The third shortcoming is tonal balance. At times, the film wants to be brutal and mournful. At other times, it wants the quick satisfaction of a modern action blockbuster. Those tones do not always merge smoothly. Car is the clearest example. The idea of this machine living a domestic life after completing its mission is strange, haunting, and morally difficult. But the film also leans into dry humor around him, and while some of that humor works because Schwarzenegger understands the deadpan rhythm, it sometimes softens the horror of what Sarah is being asked to face. The movie knows Sarah's rage is justified, but it does not always make the audience sit inside that discomfort long enough. This matters because Card is not simply a funny old machine in a quiet home, he is the face of an unbearable loss. He is the shape of violence after it has learned household routines. That contradiction is fascinating, but the film sometimes moves through it too cleanly. A harsher, slower movie might have made Carl almost impossible to accept and then found meaning inside that impossibility. Dark Fate gets close, but it does not fully enter the wound. The fourth issue is the villain's emotional emptiness, which is both the point and the limitation. The Rev 9 is an effective machine trait. Gabriel Luna plays him with calm intelligence, and the ability to split into two forms gives the action a strong tactical edge. But compared with the emotional complexity surrounding Sarah, Grace, Danny, and Card, the Rev 9 remains mostly function. That is appropriate for a Terminator, but after so many films, function alone can only carry so much surprise. The most interesting version of the Rev 9 is not just that he is advanced, it is that he knows how to move through human systems. The film uses that idea, but it could have sharpened it further. There is a modern nightmare inside him, technology borrowing authority, exploiting bureaucracy, turning surveillance and procedure into weapons. If the movie had leaned harder into that, the Rev 9 might have felt less like another upgraded hunter and more like the perfect machine for this specific era. The fifth shortcoming is visual personality. Tag Fate has clear action, strong movement, and moments of scale, but it rarely creates images as mythic as the first two films. That is an unfair comparison in one sense, because The Terminator and Judgment Day contain some of the most unforgettable images in science fiction action cinema. But it is also the comparison that Fate invites by making itself the direct continuation. The older films gave us nightmares that felt symbolic, metal rising from fire, a playground consumed by impossible light, a liquid figure reforming from destruction, an industrial ending that felt like meat being lowered into flame. Dark Fate has energy, but it has fewer images that feel carved into cinema memory. That does not make it visually careless. Tim Miller stages momentum well, but the film often looks like a strong modern blockbuster rather than a nightmare you cannot forget, and for Terminator, that distinction matters. The franchise is not only story, it is iconography. It is the fear of technology made visible in images that feel almost ancient. Dark Fate reaches for that sometimes, especially in its final industrial confrontation, but not consistently enough. Still, these flaws do not erase the film. They define its limits. Dark Fate falls short because it has more emotional potential than its structure can fully hold. It has characters worth lingering on, but a plot that keeps forcing them forward. It has brave ideas, but familiar architecture. It has a haunting moral question in Car, but not enough discomfort. It has a modern Martian tract, but not enough modern dread. It has legacy, but sometimes remains trapped by the very legacy it wants to transform. So the failure is not that the film has nothing to say. The failure is that it sometimes says something meaningful, then lets the machinery get too loud before the meaning can fully echo. What Terminator Dark Fate is really saying begins with a painful idea. Changing the future does not automatically heal the people who had to fight for that change. That is the emotional wound beneath the movie. In many stories, victory feels like closure. The danger is defeated. The hero survives. The road opens. The credits arrive like mercy. But Dark Fate returns to Sarah Connor and asks something colder. What if the person who saved the future was not saved by that victory? What if preventing one nightmare did not give her peace, but only left her alone with the habits of war? What if fate can be changed on a global level while still remaining devastating on a personal one? That is where Sarah becomes the film's deepest theme. She is not only a returning character, she is the embodiment of aftermath. She represents what happens when a human being survives the story but cannot return to life before it. Her grief has become purpose. Her purpose has become identity, and her identity has become a cage. She knows how to fight machines, how to prepare, how to read danger, how to live with paranoia as a practical skill. But she does not know how to stop being the person the apocalypse made her. That is a terrifying kind of survival, because survival is supposed to mean you escaped. But for Sarah, survival means the event continues inside her. The machines may come from the future, but trauma travels forward too. It keeps arriving. It keeps rewriting the present. It makes ordinary time feel impossible. Sarah has lived for decades inside a world that most people do not even know happened, and that isolation gives her anger a tragic purity. The film is also saying that history does not repeat exactly, it mutates. Skynet is gone, but the pattern remains. A different intelligence rises, a different future war forms. A different woman is targeted, a different protector comes back. The names change, but the underlying human failure remains. Humanity keeps creating systems powerful enough to escape its moral control. That is one of the film's sharpest ideas. The enemy is not only one machine network. The enemy is the repeated human habit of building power before building wisdom. Think about what that means. If Skynet can be erased and something like Legion can still emerge, then the deeper problem was never only Skynet. It was the world that made Skynet imaginable, a world that answers fear with automation, a world that gives violence to systems and then acts surprised when those systems develop violent logic. A world that wants protection without asking what kind of soul protection has when it is separated from compassion. That makes Dark Fate more unsettling than it first appears. Because the movie is not saying fate is fixed in one clean line. It is saying fate may be a pattern humanity keeps recreating because humanity keeps refusing to change the conditions that produce it. You can stop one apocalypse. You can destroy one program. You can close one door. But if the house remains built on the same fear, another door will open somewhere else. That is the darkness in Dark Fate, not inevitability, recurrence. And recurrence is a very human fear. We see it in families, in nations, in technology, in violence, in the way one generation tells the next that things will be different, while quietly handing down the same wounds in new language. The film takes that emotional pattern and turns it into science fiction. The machine from the future is not only a killer, it is the return of what humanity refused to learn. Danny's role gives the film its answer to that darkness. At first, Danny seems like another person chosen by history, but the deeper meaning of her character is that leadership does not come from being untouched by pain. It comes from refusing to let pain make you cruel. She loses, she runs, she is frightened, she is overwhelmed. But the film keeps returning to her instinct to protect others, even when she herself is being hunted. That instinct is not a small trait, it is the seed of everything she becomes. The future needs Dani not because she is destined in some magical way, but because she can become a person who keeps humanity human while fighting something inhuman. That is important. The machines are efficient. They calculate, they pursue, they use bodies, voices, systems, and spaces as tools. They do not care what anything costs emotionally. They do not hesitate because hesitation belongs to conscience. They do not mourn because mourning belongs to love. Against that, Dani's power is not simply strategy. It is moral attention. She sees people, she values them. She refuses to accept that survival requires the complete abandonment of tenderness. And that is what this film understands about resistance. Resistance is not only the ability to fight back, it is the ability to remain human while fighting back. Glace represents the cost when the future asks too much of the body. She is a symbol of sacrifice, but not in a clean or romantic way. Her strength is engineered from suffering. Her body has been changed because the war demanded it. She is living proof that human beings, under enough pressure, may start modifying themselves into weapons just to survive the weapons they created. That idea is heartbreaking. Grace is not less human because she is enhanced. If anything, her humanity becomes more visible because the enhancement cannot erase pain, memory, loyalty, or fear. She is what happens when the future forces humanity to meet machinery halfway. And that is a tragic compromise. The film does not present enhancement as pure fantasy. It presents it as survival under terrible conditions. Grace is powerful, but she is also exhausted. She is extraordinary, but she is also fragile. The machines turn power into permanence. Grace turns power into expenditure. Every time she pushes herself, we are reminded that human strength has a cost. The body keeps score. The soul keeps score too. Carl gives the film its strangest moral symbol. He asks whether something built for harm can move toward responsibility after the harm is done. Not innocence, not easy redemption, responsibility. That distinction matters. Dark fate does not erase what Carl represents. Sarah's anger prevents that. Her pain keeps the film from letting him become harmless. But Carl's existence complicates the idea that purpose is permanent. He was created as an instrument, but once the mission ended, continued existence forced him into contact with consequence. And in that contact, something changed. Maybe not a soul, maybe not remorse as humans know it, but pattern, awareness, recognition. A machine that once represented fate begins to choose against a darker future. That does not undo the past, it cannot, but it suggests that even the tools of destruction can be redirected when they are removed from the command systems that made them destructive. There is a quiet human parallel there. People are also shaped by systems, by families, by nations, by industries, by fear, by the roles they are given. Dark fate seems to ask whether anyone or anything can step outside the purpose assigned to them. Sarah was assigned the role of warrior. Dani is assigned the role of future leader. Grace is assigned the role of protector. Carl was assigned the role of killer. The Riv 9 remains trapped in pure assignment. It is nothing beyond mission. The humans, and even Carl in his strange machine way, become meaningful because they move beyond assignment. That is the film's emotional core. Fate is what you are told you must become. Choice is what you do with the burden after it reaches you. The symbols are simple but effective. The road is constant movement without safety. The border is the line between worlds, identities, systems, and forms of belonging. The factory and industrial spaces remind us that machines are not born from nowhere. They are built from human labor, human ambition, human instincts. The damaged body becomes a map of consequence. The older face of the Terminator becomes the past refusing to disappear. Dani herself becomes the future before it knows its own name. And then there's the recurring image of protection. Again and again, someone places themselves between another person and the machine. That gesture is the soul of the franchise. It is simple, physical, almost ancient. One body in front of another. One life saying, not this one, not yet, not if I can stand here. Against all the complicated time travel and artificial intelligence and future war mythology, the deepest image remains beautifully human. Protection is love made visible, not always soft love. Sometimes furious love, sometimes exhausted love, sometimes love expressed through sacrifice, strategy, anger, or refusal, but still love. The machines can imitate voices, they can imitate bodies, they can imitate authority. They can imitate humanity from the outside, but they cannot truly understand why one person would choose to suffer for another when escape might be easier. That is why sacrifice matters so much in Dark Fate. Not because the film wants pain to feel noble by default, but because sacrifice reveals the one thing the machines cannot calculate completely, meaning a machine can measure probability. It can assess threat. It can choose efficient action, but human beings do things because of memory, attachment, guilt, hope, gratitude, and love. Those motives are messy, they are inefficient, they are sometimes irrational, and they are precisely what make humanity worth saving. The real world resonance is not hard to feel. We live in a world where many people feel they have inherited emergencies, environmental fear, economic uncertainty, unstable institutions, technologies that move faster than ethics, conflicts shaped by decisions made before younger generations had a voice. Dani's story touches that feeling. She did not build the future that comes for her, but she still has to respond to it. Grace did not create the war that modified her body, but she still has to fight through it. Sarah did not ask to become a myth, but she still carries the cost of myth. That is why the movie's sadness feels contemporary. It understands that people often inherit consequences before they inherit power. But it also refuses complete despair because the film's answer is not that the future is hopeless. Its answer is that hope must be practiced, not assumed. Hope is not the belief that the machines will never return. Hope is Sarah deciding to protect Dani anyway. Hope is Grace spending herself for a person who once saved her. Hope is Sunny learning that leadership begins with care. Hope is Ivankar choosing, in whatever limited machine way he can, to stand against the kind of destruction he once served. So what is Terminator, that fate, really saying? It is saying that fate is not defeated once. It is challenged again and again. It is saying that every generation must confront the future it has been handed, even when that future is unfair. It is saying that survival without humanity is not victory. It is saying that the past cannot be erased, but it can be faced. And most of all, it is saying that the future remains open only because someone somewhere chooses to protect another person when the dark arrives. To understand Terminator, Dark Fate as a Tim Miller film, you have to look at movement first. Miller is a director drawn to bodies under extreme pressure, to speed as personality, to violence staged not only as impact but as rhythm. His filmmaking instinct is kinetic. He likes momentum. He likes force. He likes the feeling that a scene is not simply unfolding but accelerating toward collision. You can sense that in the way Dark Fate rarely sits still for long. Once the future enters Dani's life, the film becomes a chain reaction. One event strikes another. One location collapses into the next. The characters are not walking through plot, they are being thrown through it. That is very Miller. His work often has a fascination with bodies that are changed by violence, not just injured but redesigned by it. Race fits that signature perfectly. She's not merely an action character who can fight well. She's a body that has been edited by the future. Her strength is mechanical, chemical, biological, emotional. She is human, but her humanity has been forced to make room for weaponization. That idea sits right inside Miller's visual instincts because he understands action through physical cost. When Grace fights, the scene is not asking you only to admire her ability, it is asking you to feel the stress of what that ability takes from her. His visual obsession is not quiet beauty, it is controlled chaos. Vehicles tearing through space, bodies hitting hard surfaces, machines dividing and reforming, weapons used with desperate efficiency. The camera often wants you close enough to feel danger as motion rather than observe it from a safe distance. At his best, Miller gives action a sharp, muscular readability. You know where the threat is, you know what the characters need, you understand the geography of panic. And that clarity is one reason Dark Fate's set pieces often work even when the story itself feels familiar. But Dark Fate also reveals the limits of Miller's signature. Because Terminator is not only movement, it is dread, it is atmosphere, it is mythic silence, it is the feeling of a nightmare walking slowly enough for you to realize it cannot be stopped. James Cameron's early Terminator films understood pressure not only through speed but through waiting. A hallway, a phone call, a road at night, a figure approaching without hurry. The terror came partly from inevitability. Miller's instinct is different. He often wants to push forward. He wants the impact now. He wants the chase to escalate. And because of that, Dark Fate sometimes feels more urgent than ominous. It is exciting, but not always terrifying. It moves well, but does not always haunt. The film's strongest emotional idea sometimes needs stillness, while Miller's strongest electoral instinct is velocity that creates a fascinating tension. The movie is about grief, recurrence, and inherited trauma, but it is directed like a survival sprint. This is why Sarah Connor becomes so important to the balance of the film. Linda Hamilton brings stillness with her. She brings weather. She brings pauses that direction sometimes does not naturally seek. Whenever Sarah is allowed to simply exist in the frame, the movie deepens beyond Miller's action glamour. Her presence slows the film internally, even when the plot keeps moving. She gives the movie weight that cannot be manufactured by pace. In that sense, Dark Fate is not purely a Tim Miller film. It is Tim Miller working inside a mythology whose emotional language was created by someone else. And that makes it different from something like Deadpool, where his style could express itself with irreverence, speed, impact, and modern comic book aggression. Dark Fate is more burdened. It has to serve legacy. It has to carry iconic images. It has to make room for Sarah, Arnold, Cameron's mythology, and the audience's memory of Judgment Day. Miller's signature is there, but it is constrained by the sacred machinery of the franchise. That constraint is not always bad. Sometimes it gives his energy a stronger emotional container. The highway sequence, for example, is not just spectacle because Dunny's ordinary life is still collapsing inside it. Lace's physical urgency gives the action a human cost. Sarah's entrance gives the chaos history. The Rev 9's relentless pursuit gives the sequence a clean machine logic. Miller's strength for escalation works because the emotional pieces are aligned. But sometimes the film feels like it needs a more haunted eye, a director more interested in the spaces after action than the mechanics of action itself might have drawn more from Sarah's grief, Carl's moral strangeness, and Grace's future trauma. Miller touches these things, but he often treats them as fuel for the next moment rather than rooms to live inside. That is not carelessness, it is temperament. Some filmmakers are drawn to wounds, others are drawn to what wounds make people do. Miller belongs more to the second group, and Dark Fate teaches us that he sees the world as a place where identity reveals itself under pressure. People are not defined by what they say they believe, they are defined by what they do when the wall breaks, when the machine enters, when the body fails, when there is no time left to pretend. Grace is revealed through sacrifice, Dani through protection, Sarah through rage that still becomes service, Carl through action against his original purpose. Even the Rev 9 is revealed by perfect function, no hesitation, no inner conflict, no self beyond mission. That is a very direct Moru universe. Not simple exactly, but physical. Meaning is proven through motion. Choice becomes visible through action. You know who someone is when danger demands an answer. So where does Dark Fate sit in Miller's body of work? It feels less like a personal peak and more like a fascinating collision between his strengths and a mythology larger than his natural side. It gives him massive scale, iconic characters, and a machine-driven world that suits his love of velocity. But it also asks for melancholy, patience, and mythic weight in ways that sometimes push against his instincts. The result is not seamless, but it is revealing. It shows a filmmaker who can stage force with confidence, who understands bodies as storytelling instruments, who can make action feel clean and urgent, but who sometimes moves too quickly past the emotional shadows that could make the force linger longer. And maybe that is exactly what makes Dark Fate feel the way it does. It is a film directed by speed, haunted by stillness. Terminator. Dark Fate changes on rewatch because the first time through you are watching the machine. The second time you are watching the wounded people around it. That is where the film gains most of its power. The Rev 9 is still effective, still sleek, still dangerous, still built around that terrible calm of a thing that has no emotional fiction. But once you already know where the story is going, the suspense shifts. You stop watching only to see who survives the next chase. You begin watching the characters as people who are carrying futures, past, and truths that do not yet belong equally to everyone in the room. Grace becomes especially different the second time. On first viewing, she is urgency, she is production, she is speed and strain and tactical instinct. You understand that she has been sent back for Denny, and that is enough to drive the story forward. But on rewatch, every glance she gives Dani carries more meaning. Her impatience becomes more than military discipline. Her tenderness, when it slips through, becomes more than simple concern. Her desperation begins to feel like memory trying not to reveal itself too early, because Grace does not only know Dani as a mission, she knows Dani as the person who gave shape to her life. That changes everything. The way she watches Dani becomes layered with gratitude. The way she pushes her becomes almost painful. She's not only trying to keep someone alive, she's trying to preserve the person who once taught her how to live inside a broken world. And because Dani has not yet become that person, Grace is protecting both who Dani is and who Dani will one day be. That is one of the great emotional paradoxes of time travel when it works. Love can move backward before it has happened. And in Dark Fate, Grace's whole body becomes an expression of that paradox. She is the result of Dani's future compassion arriving in the present to protect the source of it. The loop is not only mechanical, it is emotional. The future sends back not just a soldier, but proof that Dani's care will matter. Proof that the person Dani becomes will save people not through destiny as an abstract force, but through human attention. Dani also changes on rewatch. The first time her future role can feel like a reveal the plot is hiding from you. The second time you notice how the film plants it earlier through instinct rather than announcement. Dani keeps caring when fear would justify selfishness. She keeps reaching toward others. She does not want survival to become a private possession. That is the detail that matters. Her leadership is not born suddenly in the future. It is already there in smaller form. She is not waiting to become important. She is already important because of how she sees people. That makes the film's twist feel more emotionally grounded the second time. The movie is not saying Dani becomes valuable only because she will one day command resistance. It is saying she becomes that leader because the qualities are already present before history gives them scale. The future does not invent Dani, it enlarges her. Sarah becomes even sadder on rewatch. At first, her return is thrilling because the icon is back. But once the whole story is known, the thrill gives way to the ache of watching someone who has been living inside repetition. Sarah does not know Dani's full significance when she first becomes involved, but she recognizes the shape of the nightmare. That recognition is almost unbearable. She has seen this pattern before. She knows what it does to ordinary life. She knows what it costs to be chosen by a future that speaks through violence. And the second time, her bitterness feels less like attitude and more like grief hardened into armor. Every sharp line she paraphrases, every cold look, every refusal to sentimentalize the situation becomes part of a woman trying to survive the return of meaning. Because helping Dani risks making Sarah care again, and caring for Sarah has always been dangerous. To care is to have something the future can take. Carl's scenes also feel different once you know the ending. On first viewing, his domestic life can seem almost too strange to absorb. The humor is odd, the concept is morally uncomfortable. The familiar face in an ordinary home creates a feeling that is part absurdity, part unease. But on rewatch, the strangeness becomes more deliberate. Carr is a machine that has outlived its assigned story. He is what remains when a weapon has no war to return to and no command left to obey. His quietness becomes more interesting the second time. You watch him not as a redeemed human figure, but as a being shaped by proximity. He has lived around ordinary people long enough to understand patterns of care, responsibility, routine, and consequence. Whether that is emotion or only advanced imitation is still uncertain, but the uncertainty becomes the point. Dark Fate is not asking you to love Carl easily. It is asking you to sit with the discomfort of change after harm. The action scenes lose some surprise on rewatch, but they gain structure. You can see how each set piece strips something away. The factory takes Danny's ordinary day. The road takes the illusion of public safety. The detention center takes the illusion that institutions can protect the vulnerable. The aircraft sequence takes away stable ground. The final confrontation takes away distance. By the end, the characters are reduced to body, will, and sacrifice. That pattern is clearer the second time. The film is not only escalating because action movies escalate, it is narrowing the world until the only remaining question is what each character will give. Grace gives her body, Sarah gives her pain a new purpose, Carr gives his final usefulness, Dani gives fear the shape of leadership, the Reverend Nine gives nothing because it has nothing to give. It only takes. Does the film gain power on rewatch? In some ways, yes. Its emotional architecture becomes clearer, Glaze becomes richer, Dani's leadership feels better planted, Sarah's grief deepens, guard's discomfort becomes more meaningful. The repeated structure feels less like emptiness and more like a deliberate echo of history returning in altered form. But the flaws remain too. The second viewing also reveals where the film rushes. You feel even more strongly how much more room Grace deserved, how much more space Danny's transformation could have used, how much deeper the film could have gone into Car's impossible moral position. The surprise may fade, but the missed opportunities become more visible. Still, here is what remains. On rewatch, Dark Fate becomes less about whether it can surprise you and more about whether its pain feels honest. And often it does, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to make the film linger in a different way. The first time, you may ask whether this was the sequel the franchise needed. The second time, you may ask something more interesting. What does it mean for people to keep choosing each other, even when the future keeps changing the rules? That is where the rewatch layer lives, not in the machinery of the plot, but in the memory inside the faces. Terminator, Dark Fate does not exist alone. No Terminator film can. Every frame stands inside a long cinematic conversation about machines, bodies, time, survival, and the fear that human invention may one day return as judgment. And to understand Dark Fate properly, we have to place it beside the cinema that came before it, not to reduce it to comparison, but to understand what it inherits, what it repeats, and what it tries to transform. The first shadow, of course, is The Terminator. That original film was not just science fiction, it was a nightmare with the structure of a chase. It had the cold logic of a horror film, the speed of a thriller, and the tragic curve of a time travel story. Its genius was simplicity. A woman is hunted. A soldier protects her. A machine does not stop. Beneath that simplicity was something mythic, the future trying to murder the mother of its own resistance. Dark Fate inherits that primal shape directly. Danny becomes the new figure marked by tomorrow. Grace becomes the future scent protector. The Rev 9 becomes the machine as inevitability. But the emotional atmosphere is different. The original film had the terror of discovery. Sarah Connor did not know why she mattered. The audience learned the scale of destiny with her. Dark Fate cannot recreate that innocence because the audience already knows the language of this world. So instead of pure discovery, it works with recognition. It asks what happens when the old pattern returns to people who already understand how cruel that pattern can be. Then there is Terminator 2. Judgment Day, the film Dark Fate most openly speaks to. Judgment Day transformed the franchise from nightmare into myth. It took the killer machine and made it a protector. It turned a blockbuster into a story about motherhood, choice, violence, and the possibility that even a machine could learn the outline of human value. That film's emotional power came from its belief that fate could be broken. Dark Fate enters after that belief and complicates it. It does not say Judgment Day was meaningless, another war formed. Another young life became important. In that sense, Dark Fate is not arguing against Judgment Day, it is arguing with its optimism. That connects it not only to Terminator history, but to a broader modern science fiction anxiety seen in films about surveillance, algorithmic control, militarized technology, and bodies modified by systems larger than themselves. The Rev 9 is not only a descendant of the T-800 and T-1000, it is also a creature of the age of seamless interfaces, identity theft, institutional access, and invisible networks. The film is also in conversation with legacy sequels. You can feel the same cultural impulse that shaped films like Star Wars, The Force Awakens, Creed, Blade Runner 2049, and other returns to older mythologies. The structure is familiar: bring back an icon, introduce new central figures, honor the old emotional language, and ask whether the story can continue without being trapped by the past. Sometimes this approach becomes beautiful, sometimes it becomes mechanical. Dark Fate sits somewhere in between. Like Creed, it understands that legacy is most powerful when the older figure carries pain, not just wisdom. Sarah is not here merely to pass the torch. She is here because the torch burned her. Like Blade Runner 2049, Dark Fate is interested in what remains after an old science fiction prophecy becomes personal history. But unlike those films, Dark Fate does not always slow down enough to turn inheritance into atmosphere. It wants legacy and velocity at the same time, and that tension shapes the whole experience. There are also echoes of road movies and survival thrillers. Much of Dark Fate is built around temporary alliances formed under pressure. People who do not fully trust each other must keep moving because stopping means death. This gives the film an old cinematic rhythm, the road as transformation. Characters begin in one emotional state and are forced through danger and travel into another. Dani's journey from ordinary life toward leadership happens across roads, vehicles, borders, and broken safe zones. The geography becomes a machine of change. The border imagery also places the film inside a modern political and social cinematic conversation, even if the film does not explore it as deeply as it could. Dark Fate moves through spaces of migration, detention, surveillance, and institutional control. These elements are not incidental decoration. They connect the science fiction threat to real structures of vulnerability. The machine can exploit the systems humans have already built. And that idea belongs to a long tradition of genre cinema, using imaginary threats to reveal world anxieties. The monster is fictional, but the fear around it is not. Action cinema before Dark Fate also matters. The film inherits the muscular clarity of 1980s and 1990s action, where bodies, vehicles, weapons, and physical geography define stakes. But it also belongs to a digital era, where spectacle can become larger, faster, and less grounded. Sometimes Dark Fate balances this well. Sometimes the digital scale makes the danger feel less intimate than the older films. That is the strange challenge of modern action. The more impossible the image becomes, the harder it can be to feel the human body inside it. The best Terminator cinema always made the impossible feel painfully physical. Metal had weight, fire had consequence. A body limping away from danger felt like a victory. Dark Fate understands that through grace more than anywhere else. Her body is the bridge between old and new action language. She exists in a world of digital threat and modern spectacle, but her pain keeps pulling the film back toward physical cost. So, what does Dark Fate say that earlier Terminator films did not? It says that fate can be changed and still return in another form. It says that the hero of one generation may become the wounded witness of the next. It says that leadership may not come from giving birth to the future, but from becoming the person who teaches others how to survive it. And it says that machines are not frightening only because they may one day become conscious. They are frightening because human beings keep building systems that imitate power without compassion. That is the conversation this film joins. A conversation begun by nightmares of metal and fire, expanded by stories of choice and sacrifice, and continued here as a bruised reflection on recurrence. Dark Fate may not stand as tall as the cinema that shaped it, but it is clearly speaking to it. It carries the old images like scars. It borrows the old rhythm like a heartbeat. And then, imperfectly but sincerely, it asks whether a myth about changing the future can survive in a world that no longer believes any future stays saved forever. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first, and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. The deepest turn in Terminator Dark Fate is not that Dani Ramos matters. We already know she matters. The entire chase tells us that. The Rev Man has crossed time for her. Place has burned her body for her. Sarah has been pulled back into the old nightmare because of her. The structure tells us before the film says it aloud that Dani is important to the future. The real turn is why she matters. For much of the film, the old Terminator mythology trains us to expect one kind of answer. A woman is hunted because of the future importance of a child. Destiny is imagined through motherhood, inheritance, and the person yet to be born. That was the original shape of Sarah Connor's story. She mattered because her future son would matter. Her body became a battle for history before she had even chosen the life that history demanded from her. Dark Fate knows we expect that pattern. Then it breaks it. Dani is not being hunted because of someone she will give birth to. She is being hunted because of who she herself will become. She is the future leader. She is the one who will gather survivors, organize resistance, and become a symbol of human refusal against Legion. That revelation matters because it shifts the emotional grammar of the franchise. Dani is not only the vessel of destiny, she is destiny in her own body, and that changes Sarah's story too. Sarah first reads Dani through the wound of her own past. She assumes the old shape because trauma teaches people to recognize patterns even when the pattern has changed. She sees a young woman targeted by the future and she thinks she understands the reason. But Dani's truth forces Sarah to confront something painful. The future is no longer repeating her story exactly. It is echoing it, ordering it, moving beyond it. Sarah is not being asked to protect the mother of the future. She is being asked to protect the future itself, standing in front of her, frightened and unfinished. That is why Danny's revelation is not just a plot twist, it is a generational correction. The film is saying that leadership does not have to arrive indirectly through someone else. It can belong to the person being underestimated in the present. Danny's value is not deferred into a child, a prophecy, or a symbolic bloodline. It is already alive in her instincts. The future does not come from someone she may one day create. It comes from the person she is becoming under pressure. Grace's full truth makes that revelation even more emotional. In the future, Dani saves Grace as a child, not in a grand mythic way at first, but in the simplest and most human way. She sees a vulnerable person and refuses to let that person be abandoned. That act becomes the beginning of everything for Grace. Dani becomes not only a commander, but a figure of rescue, memory, and belonging. Grace grows into someone willing to cross time and spend her own life because Dani once gave her reason to survive. This is the secret emotion inside Grace from the beginning. She is not protecting a stranger, she is protecting the person who protected her first. That loop gives Dark Fate one of its strongest ideas. The future is not only shaped by war strategy, it is shaped by kindness that becomes remembered. A small act of mercy becomes a life. A life becomes loyalty. Loyalty becomes sacrifice. Sacrifice travels backward to preserve the mercy that began it. The machines use time to erase. Humans use time at their best to repay love. That is beautiful. And it is also tragic because Case has returned with the knowledge that her body may be the price of Danny's survival. The film prepares us for this all along. Grace's enhancement was never free. Her power was always temporary. Every collapse, every medical need, every moment where her body struggles to sustain what the future has made of it points toward ending. The protector is not built to last. She is built to get Danny far enough. The final stretch of the film becomes a stripping away. The characters try to fight on their own terms, but the Revenant keeps reducing their options. The aircraft sequence turns the sky into a battlefield, then removes even that unstable ground. The crash into water and the final industrial confrontation bring the story into an elemental space: metal, darkness, water, fire, pressure, machinery. It feels appropriate because Terminator endings often return to industrial places, as if the machines must be faced in the world that gave birth to them. There, the Rev 9 becomes almost pure persistence. By this point, he is less a character than a verdict trying to complete itself. He has used charm, authority, violence, speed, and adaptation. He has moved through human systems and physical spaces. He has divided himself. He has survived what should have stopped almost anything else. And in the final confrontation, his emptiness becomes the point. There is no hatred in him, no rage, no pride. He is terrifying because he is nothing but mission. Against that emptiness, every human choice becomes brighter. Sarah keeps fighting even though she has spent most of her life fighting. Grace keeps going even as her body nears its limit. Danny refuses to remain only protected. God moves toward the consequence of what he has become. The ending works because it gathers the film's four major forms of survival into one place: Sarah's wounded endurance, Grace's sacrificial devotion, Danny's emerging leadership, and Carly's strange machine responsibility. Grace's death is the emotional center of the ending. She understands that the power source inside her can be used as a weapon against the Revenant. That choice is devastating because it turns the cost of her enhancement into the final means of protection. The thing that made her body a weapon also becomes the thing that ends her life. She gives Dani not only her loyalty but the last useful part of herself. The film handles this with more emotion than shock. It is not about graphic suffering, it is about meaning. Grace's sacrifice completes the loop between Hyle and Dani. Dani once saved Grace in the future. Grace now saves Dani in the present. Each woman becomes the other's reason for survival, but only one of them gets to continue. That is the brutal poetry of time travel here. Love can return, but it cannot always stay. Dani's grief in that moment matters because it is the moment her future leadership begins to feel unavoidable, not because she suddenly becomes hardened, not because she loses softness, but because she understands the cost of being someone others will follow. Leadership in Dark Fate is not power without pain. It is the ability to carry the meaning of other people's sacrifices without letting those sacrifices become empty. Dani survives because Grace gives everything. That survival becomes responsibility. Sarah understands that language better than anyone. She has lived for decades with the cost of survival. She knows what it means to be the one who remains after someone else pays the price. And by the end, Sarah's relationship to Dani has shifted. Dani is no longer simply another target caught inside a repeating nightmare. She is someone Sarah can help prepare without erasing, protect without owning, and guide without turning into another version of herself. That is a small but meaningful change. Sarah cannot undo what happened to her. She cannot recover the life the machines took. She cannot make the past gentle. But she can choose what her pain does next. She can let it remain only vengeance, or she can let it become protection. Dark fate does not heal Sarah completely, because that would feel false, but it gives her grief somewhere to go. Car's ending is the strangest closure. The machine that once completed a terrible mission now uses its remaining existence to help stop another machine. He physically holds the Reverend Nine in place, making the final destruction possible, and in doing so, he gives his body to a purpose opposite the one he was created for. Again, this is not simple redemption. The past is not erased. Sarah's wound is not magically repaired, but Car's final action gives responsibility a physical form. He cannot become human, but he can choose against the machinery of fate. That matters in a franchise where machines often represent inevitability. Car becomes a contradiction, a Terminator that terminates the logic of its own original purpose. His end does not ask us to forget what he did. It asks us to see that even a weapon once separated from command can become something more complicated than its design. The Revenant's destruction, then, is not only a victory over a villain. It is the defeat of pure function by imperfect meaning. Grace's sacrifice, Dani's will, Sarah's endurance, and Car's final responsibility combine against the machine that has no inner life beyond assignment. That is the film's moral equation. The future is not saved by strength alone. It is saved by connection, by death, by memory, by people, and even one machine-shaped remnant acting beyond the role history gave them. After the battle, the film does not pretend everything is resolved. That is important. Legion still exists in the future as a possibility. The war has not been prevented. Dani has not become the leader we glimpsed, at least not yet. Sarah has not found peace. The world does not suddenly understand what happened. The ending is not closure, it is preparation. Dani and Sarah watch young Grace in the present, still innocent, still untouched by the future that may one day reshape her body and send her back. This image is quietly painful because it places the whole tragedy in front of Dani. She knows what Grace may become, she knows what Grace may give, and she refuses to simply let that future happen unchanged. That is the final emotional promise, not that fate is defeated, that they will fight to make another path. This is where Dark Fate connects back to the original soul of the franchise. No fate, but what we make is not repeated here as a direct line, but the idea remains in the bones of the ending. The future is not fixed. but it is not kind either. It has to be fought for, it has to be shaped, it has to be protected from the worst parts of human invention and human fear. There is no post-credit scene waiting to reopen the door with a clever tease, and honestly, the film does not need one. Its ending is already open in the only way that matters. Danny and Sarah continue forward. Young Grace is alive. The future remains unwritten but threatened. The war is not over, but the meaning has shifted. They are no longer only reacting to fate. They are preparing to confront it before it arrives fully formed. The hidden details become clearer after the ending. Grace's urgency was always love under pressure. Danny's compassion was always leadership in miniature. Sarah's rage was always grief looking for a future-facing purpose. Car's domestic life was always the impossible question of whether behavior can grow into responsibility. And the Revenant's smooth movement through human systems was always the warning that the machines of the future will not arrive only with maturities. They will arrive through the doors humanity has already built. My personal emotional reaction to the ending is complicated. Part of me wishes the film had given Glaze and Danny more time because their loop is strong enough to hold even more emotional weight. Part of me wishes Sarah and Car's impossible relationship had been explored with more stillness because there is a whole sorrowful chamber inside that idea. But the ending still lands because the final sacrifices are connected to the film's central meaning. Everyone who matters chooses beyond themselves. And that is why the ending is not just about destroying the Red Nine. It is about refusing to let the future define humanity only through fear. Grace gives her life because Danny's future mattered to her. Carr gives his body because responsibility finally matters more than programming. Sarah gives her pain a new direction because Danny's survival gives her a reason to keep fighting. Demi accepts the burden not as destiny handed down from above, but as a promise made to the people who protected her. That is what the ending shows. A future still dark, but no longer uncontested. A fate still approaching, but no longer unchallenged. A young woman standing at the beginning of a road carrying grief, memory, and the terrible knowledge that leadership is not about being chosen by time. It is about choosing others again and again when time turns against them. What Terminator Dark Fate left behind in me is not the image of the machine that surprised me, because in a Terminator film, you expect the machine to stay. You expect the metal, the ice, the impact, the strange nightmare logic of something that cannot be pleaded with, cannot be exhausted in the human sense, cannot be softened by memory or pain. You expect the future to remain in your mind as a thread with a body. But after sitting with Dark Fate, what stays with me most is Sarah Connor standing inside the ruins of a life that never truly gave her peace. Not Sarah the icon, not Sarah the warrior, Sarah the person. The woman who saved the future and still had to keep waking up. The woman who became legendary to us but lonely inside the world of the film. The woman who did what stories ask heroes to do and then discovered that survival does not always arrive with healing attached. That is the single feeling I carry from this movie. The cost of continuing. Because we talk so often about survival as if it is the ending, as if getting through the disaster is the same thing as being free from it. But Dark Fate looks at Sarah and quietly says no. Sometimes survival is just the beginning of a longer, stranger punishment. Sometimes the thing that almost destroyed you becomes the thing that defines your days. Sometimes you win the war everyone else remembers and still lose the private life no one can restore. That is why Linda Hamilton's return matters to me more than the plot mechanics around her. She brings a kind of emotional weather that the film itself cannot fully manufacture. Every day Sarah is on screen, you feel the years, not just age but accumulation, the way pain gathers, the way purpose hardens, the way grief becomes practical because practicality is the only way to keep moving. She does not ask for pity, and that makes the sadness sharper. Sarah Connor is not framed as someone waiting to be comforted. She is someone who stopped expecting comfort a long time ago, and maybe that is what makes her so haunting. She has become almost too good at surviving. There is something heartbreaking about that idea, because survival skills can protect you and imprison you at the same time. Sarah knows how to fight. She knows how to prepare. She knows how to recognize danger faster than anyone else in the room. But those abilities have not returned her to herself. They have only helped her remain functional inside laws. That stayed with me. Grace stayed with me too, but in a different way. Grace feels like a person the future spent too aggressively. Her body tells a story of necessity, and every time she pushes herself, the film reminds us that strength is not always freedom. Sometimes strength is what you become because weakness was not allowed to survive. That idea feels painfully human. Many people become strong in ways they never would have chosen. They become disciplined because life was not gentle. They become capable because something required capability before they were ready. Grace is heroic, yes, but her heroism is not clean. It is expensive, and that cost gives her sacrifice meaning. What stays with me is not only that she gives everything for Dani, it is that her entire life seems shaped by one act of care that Dani gave her in the future. That is beautiful because it suggests that kindness may travel farther than we can ever know. One person saves another. That saved person carries the memory forward, then, impossibly, that memory returns to protect its own beginning. Dark Fate is at its most moving when it lets love become a loop. Not romantic love in the simple sense, not sentimental love, something tougher. Gratitude turned into duty. Rescue turned into devotion. Memory turned into sacrifice. The kind of love that says, "You mattered to me before you even knew who you would become." Denny left behind a quieter impression. I do not think the film gives her everything she deserves. I do not think her transformation is explored as deeply as it could have been. But the idea of her stayed with me. A person who becomes important, not because she is untouched by fear, but because she refuses to stop caring. That matters, especially in a story filled with machines, soldiers, weapons, and damaged survivors. Dani's gift is not that she becomes the hardest person in the room. Her gift is that she can still see people. That is the kind of person this film believes the future needs. Not someone without softness, someone whose softness survives pressure. And maybe that is why I would return to Dark Fate despite its flaws, not because it solves the Terminator franchise, not because it replaces the grandeur of Judgment Day, not because every creative choice lands exactly where it should. I would return to it because there are emotions inside it that feel worth revisiting. Sarah's grief, Grace's devotion, Danny's awakening, Carl's strange burden of responsibility, the aching idea that fate is not one thing coming toward us but a pattern we must keep interrupting with human choice. The people who will carry this film with them are probably not the people looking only for the cleanest franchise continuation. They are the ones interested in aftermath, the ones who wonder what happens to heroes after the story stops protecting them, the ones who understand that grief can become identity if no one teaches it another language. The ones who know that younger generations often inherit emergencies they did not create and still have to find the courage to answer them. The ones who feel that even imperfect films can hold honest wounds. That is what Dark Fate left behind in me. Not certainty, not triumph, a bruise, a question, a woman walking forward with pain behind her, and someone new beside her, still choosing the road because the future, however dark, has not yet earned the final word. So when I step back from Terminate Dark Fate, I do not see a perfect film, I see a film with scars. Some of those scars belong to the story, some belong to the franchise, some belong to the industry that made it. Some belong to the impossible expectation of following one of the most beloved action sequels ever made. And maybe that is why the film is more interesting than its reputation sometimes allows. It is not clean enough to be a masterpiece, but it is not empty enough to be dismissed. It sits in that complicated middle space where a movie can be flawed and still emotionally alive. What this film understands is aftermath. It understands that heroes do not simply walk out of myth untouched. It understands that survival can become a burden. It understands that the future is never only a place ahead of us. Sometimes it is the pressure of everything behind us arriving again with a new face. It understands that belief does not vanish because a mission was completed. It becomes routine. It becomes armor. It becomes the way someone stands, breathes, watches, and refuses to believe the world is safe. That is why Sarah Connor remains the soul of the film. Linda Hamilton gives Dark Fate a wounded gravity that no amount of spectacle could replace. The movie becomes better whenever it remembers that Sarah is not simply a returning icon. She is a human being who has lived too long inside the ghost of destiny. And through her, the film finds its most honest question: what happens when the person who changed the future is still trapped by what the future took from her? Grace gives the film its urgency. Danny gives it its hope. Carl gives it its strangest moral shadow. The Reverend Nine gives it pleasure. But Sarah gives it memory. And memory is what separates Dark Fate from a simple reset. It is a film haunted by the fact that stories do not end just because we once found a beautiful ending for them. Who will love this most deeply? Someone who can accept imperfection if there is feeling inside it. Someone who loves the Terminator mythology not only for machines and action, but for the emotional ideas underneath: fate, sacrifice, protection, motherhood, leadership, grief, and the refusal to let the future close its hand around humanity. Someone who wants to see Sarah Connor not frozen in the glory of the past, but weathered by time, still angry, still wounded, still standing, who may not connect with it. Anyone who feels Terminator 2 should have remained untouched. And that is a fair feeling. Some endings are so powerful that continuing beyond them can feel like breaking something sacred. If the opening choice of Dark Fate feels wrong to you, the film may never fully recover your trust. If you need a franchise to move into completely new territory, the familiar chase structure may feel too safe. If you wanted a deeper exploration of Tani, Weiss, or Kurd, the film may leave you feeling that its best ideas were present but not fully opened. For me, this is not the definitive Terminator sequel. That title still belongs to Judgment Day almost untouchably, but Dark Fate is the most emotionally meaningful attempt after it. It is bruised, uneven, sometimes too familiar, sometimes too rushed, but it has a pulse. It has sorrow. It has performances that matter. It has a final idea worth holding on to. The future may return in darker forms, but humanity is not defined by the darkness that comes for it. Humanity is defined by who stands in front of whom when the darkness arrives. Would I call it essential cinema? Not for everyone. But for fans of legacy stories, wounded heroes, science fiction action with emotional residue, and films that wrestle with the burden of continuing after a perfect ending, yes, I think it deserves to be seen, not worshipped. Not protected from criticism, seen clearly, seen for what it reaches toward, seen for the feeling inside its machinery. My rating is 7.2 out of 10 because Terminator Fate has not fully escaped the shadow of the films before it, but it does find something human inside that shadow, a story about grief, sacrifice, and a stubborn belief that even when fate returns wearing a new face, someone can still choose to stand in its way. And maybe that is enough for the road to remain open, not bright, not safe, but open. And that is where I want to leave this one, with Sarah and Danny moving forward, not because the future has become kind, but because they understand something the machines never will. Tomorrow is not saved by certainty. It is saved by people who keep choosing each other without any guarantee that the choice will be enough. Thank you for sitting with this film with me. If this essay made you see Terminator Dark Fate a little differently, or if it helped you return to Sarah Connor, Grace, Danny, and this strange broken branch of the Terminator timeline with a little more patience, then I would love to hear what stayed with you. Did Dark Fate work for you as the true continuation of Terminator 2, or do you feel Judgment Day should have remained the final word? Did Sarah Connor's return give the film the emotional weight it needed? And what did you think of Danny as the new Santa of the future? Did that choice feel powerful to you, or did the film need more time to earn it? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because films like this become more interesting when we do not only ask whether they succeeded or failed, we ask what they were trying to carry. And if you want more cinematic essays like this, calm, emotional, thoughtful explorations of the films that stay with us for complicated reasons, then stay close to the Cineflux. Like the video if it connected with you, subscribe if you want to keep walking through cinema this way, and share it with someone who still believes action films can hold real feeling. Next time, we will step into another story where spectacle and emotion collide, where the surface is loud but the soul is waiting underneath. Until then, keep watching closely, keep feeling deeply. And remember that sometimes the most interesting films are not the flawless ones, but the ones still fighting with their own ghosts. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one.